Hello, my name's Sylvester McCoy. I played Doctor Who. Number 7. Yes, a long time ago. Anyway, you're listening to Neil. No, you're not. Listen to me. Anyway, you might be soon listening to Neil podding.
Neil Before Blog presents Neil Before Pod.
Hello and welcome to Neil Before Pod, the podcast that will hopefully make all your wishes come true, with perhaps a catch. I'm your host Craig, and we are here to discuss the second / however many season of Doctor Who, the second Shooty Gatwa one anyway. Joining me for this discussion, we have fished him out from the Underverse. It's Darren Mooney. He's back. Hello.
Hello, and I am just about barely in better shape than Omega, to be honest, this evening. My nasal passage is similarly well cleared.
Spoilers.
Oh, sorry, apologies. From other residents of the Underverse. But yes, how are things?
They're good. Ready to talk some Doctor Who. Also joining is the resident Doctor Who expert. It's one of his two things, as he often says. It's Isaac. Hello.
Hello, yep. I was bi-generated out of Darren for a chat. Now there's two of us to join in the conversation. There's
bi-generation, and there's fleeing the Underverse, and there's wishes coming true. We're off to a great start.
How will we resolve all of this in like an hour special? Yep, that's the question.
The answer is we won't. In case you weren't listening, we are here to discuss the latest series of Doctor Who. It's technically Series 2, but who knows with numbering these days, it's just all over the place. So we'll start with some brief spoiler-free thoughts. Darren, as the guest, do you want to start? What did you think of this series?
I broadly quite liked it. You had me on last year to talk about Season 1 or Series 1 or Season 14 or Season, was it 39 or 40, whichever one it was last year. But you had me on to talk about the first Shooty Gatwa season, and I made the point that it applies pretty much the same this year, which is that the tendency with Davies seasons, and this goes back to his original tenure as well, is to let the finale overshadow absolutely everything else. So much of the discourse around the season inevitably focuses on the ending and the resolution, but I think part of the magic of Doctor Who is that it is, to quote the WAS review of Deadly Assassin, is that it is episodic. And so you have 8 episodes a year, 6 of those are basically functionally standalone episodes, even if they are interconnected. And as such, I don't tend to let the finale unduly influence my opinion of the season. I quite like this. I think this is handily the best season since, I guess, season 10, back in 2017, I want to go back to. I think it's a very well-constructed season up until the finale. I think it has a whole bunch of good episodes. I think the average quality is probably a little bit higher than it was last year, even if it doesn't hit the same highs. I don't know that this season contains 3 episodes as good as Boom, 73 Yards, and Dot and Bubble, but I do think that it has a fairly solid run of episodes straight from the beginning through to the middle, and then of course story and engine in the second half as well. So broadly put, pretty good. I'm reasonably happy with this. I don't think it is one of the greatest seasons ever. I don't think it's one of the worst seasons ever. I think it's fine. That's my hot take.
It's actually quite funny to look at how the online discourse evolved over the course of the season. It was very much, this is pretty good actually, quite enjoying this. And then the finale was, Davies has to go, get him, he's ruined this show forever. Just amazing to see how everybody turns on the person they want to blame.
Not to open up the debate again, but this is one of those things, where were you during Davies Era 1? I think Parting of the Ways is a fantastic finale, but I think that once you get past that, the Davies finales are whatever works for you, but they are all varieties of messy, clumsy, emotional, thematic storytelling that doesn't necessarily cohere tightly in terms of plot, and I don't think there is a vastly sizable difference between The Giggle, Empire, Death, and this most recent one, as compared to, I don't know off the top of my head, Last of the Time Lords, or The End of Time Part 2, or if you want to be really spicy, Doomsday and Journey's End. They are all of a similar type, they all do similar things. Any criticism you can make of one of those episodes, you can make of pretty much all the other episodes, and I find it really interesting that you have a generation of TV viewer who presumably came of age with Davies 1, who is now like, how dare you do this to Doctor Who? This thing that you have always done at the end of a season. I find the reaction very interesting in that sense.
It just shows how fickle the audience can be, though, and that can apply to anything. If you don't stick the landing, and so few things do stick the landing, you just end up alienating this base of people that don't understand that a season is more than just 1 or 2 episodes at the end.
I do also think there is a nostalgia effect in play there, where I think people remember many of those finales being better than they were. I was there when the 3rd season ended with Tinkerbell Jesus Doctor. Wasn't that what they called him online? I remember that reaction. That reaction was vicious and vitriolic. I remember criticisms of Journey's End. I remember the reaction to The End of Time Part 2. It is not new. I think the intensity of it is ramped up, but that's because the intensity of everything is ramped up now culturally. But I think there is a sense of nostalgia bias in play, where a lot of people who are online now on social media would have watched the Davies era either at the time when they were very young and not on social media, and therefore didn't know what the reaction to those episodes was, or in reruns, going back and binging the entire 4 seasons and specials, in which case the finales become less important than they are if it's the last Doctor Who you're going to get in a year, several years, potentially forever. So I think there is a reason for it, but it is interesting, I think, in terms of context.
And Isaac, what were your thoughts on this series?
I think it was an improvement on last year. I think, remember, on this, I wasn't particularly warm about last year's, but I think this year's is a little better. It's odd because I think this year the first 3 was the big highlight ones. They seem to get the best response from people. So it's odd. Last year was episode 3, 4, 5. This year, 1, 2, 3. So if we do get another series on, it's going to end amazingly. We're going to get one perfect series in 3 different installments. So there is still Rusty Davis is Rusty Davis. Another one, I know we were talking about finales just then, but when he brings back monsters or villains, they don't last very long. Usually it's half a story. But say back in the days of Stavros and the Time Lords and John Sims Master blaring out and firing away within the span of an episode, people are still surprised when, say, last year there was Sutek, who was watching things from top of his TARDIS like Snoopy, and then so we'll get into this series as well. It's always the same with a lot of the Doctors as well, though. It's the second series, they're a bit more settled in. They filmed a few episodes and they kind of know what they want their Doctor to be or they want the dynamic to be. So I think this is definitely sort of an improvement. I was definitely more excited to watch. Then again, there is also things like last year I was busy during the summer, so I had to do a lot of catch up, which meant that inevitably the first 4 or 5 episodes, I tried my best to avoid spoilers, but didn't go into any of them blind. Whereas this year I was much more of a pure watch, which probably added to the enjoyment as well. There's definitely lots to talk about and lots to look forward to in the future as well.
I'm just going to echo that. I thought it was a good season as well. I agree with you, Darren. I don't think it hit the highs that the previous series did, but I also feel like it was more consistent. I think it was more of a baseline of quality across the season, and we can talk about as we go whether we think that's better or not. Is it better that we have the burning bright for a couple of episodes and then the rest are maybe not up to much, or are we better off with a bunch of serviceable ones that all work as part of an enjoyable season on the whole? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is, but we can maybe talk about it. Yeah, I liked it. I think Ncuti Gatwa was very good. I liked the new companion. I thought some of the stories were pretty good. The finale was the finale, but I'm able to manage my expectations when it comes to Davies finales because I know what he does and I know what we're getting. And I think the only episode I actively really disliked was the penultimate one, Wishworld.
Interesting.
It just wasn't for me. I went to the cinema to watch the final episode.
As did I.
I staved off watching Wishworld for the week. So I would see it for the first time in the cinema. And I'm glad I did because I feel like I would have been driven to distraction if I was trying to watch it at home. Again, we'll get to all that. So yes, a good series of Doctor Who. And who knows what the future holds for the show, but we'll get into it. So since we've done that, our spoiler-free thoughts, should we activate the Sonic and get into the spoilers?
I love that it's an actual Sonic.
An actual prop. For those who can't see, I have a prop. Okay, let's do it. We are in the spoilers. Fun fact, I had to buy new batteries for this in order to do this.
That's commitment to the bit. I love that you could just have edited it in post, be like, nope, we're doing this properly. Practical effects on Neil Before Pod.
Yeah, I have that little toy sonic screwdriver, and damn it, I'm going to use it for some practical purpose.
The Christopher Nolan of podcasting is what they call you, Greg.
There is some irony to using a real screwdriver to open up the battery compartment of my sonic screwdriver to replace the batteries.
I suppose it's for kids, it has to be, but yeah, I suppose, yeah, that makes sense. I'm surprised they have to screwdriver, it doesn't just slide off.
Yeah, it needs to not fall to bits.
I do remember as a kid, prior to the return of Doctor Who, because I got really into Doctor Who in like 1999, I got given a gift. It was one of those electric screwdrivers, but not with the pieces, because I was like 10. But I was given the handle, the grip and the handle, so I could press the button and you could see where the inner workings of the hexagonal thing would spin. It's a sonic screwdriver that I could play with and make a slight hum and the thing would spin. I was like, well, it is a screwdriver and it does more than a thingy one. So that was my sonic screwdriver of my youth, just as part of a tool.
Really thoughtful gift.
Yeah, it's really a magic gift. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something jammed in the top or it broke and the relative was like, well, I can't actually use this.
And it was a hand-me-down, yeah.
I don't know if it was especially bought, but I remember being in love with this actual screwdriver that I had as a toy to play my Fifth Doctor era running around in back in the day.
Peter Capaldi would be proud. He was all about anybody of any economic background can be the Doctor.
Yeah, all you need is a set of sunglasses, cheap sunglasses.
Sunglasses, a hoodie, and that's it. You're all good to go. And a towering acting ability.
And an Oscar, presumably, yeah. The only Doctor who has an Oscar, right?
Yeah. In The Doctor Falls, when the Master's stabbed in the back with a knife, that was Peter Capaldi going, well, you could do that in the playground. So you don't have to use your laser umbrella.
Just find a sharp piece of metal. It's fine.
It's a sharp piece of metal. You can recreate it.
Yeah, that was a tangent. Let's get into the show. When I was creating the agenda for this, I was trying to come up with things about the Doctor in terms of an arc this season, and I feel like he didn't really have one. There's something about him almost doggedly going through the motions in a lot of ways. It's something that, to me, is common with the David Tennant era as well. It's this guy who travels because he doesn't have anything else. He gets a new companion because that's what he does. He travels around because that's what he does. He solves problems because that's what he does. Except this one has, in theory, been through a lot of therapy and is fine now. He's ready for a whole new mess of trauma to weigh him down.
I think sometimes it is just quite nice to not necessarily be entirely Doctor focused, especially because over the last few, like say with David Tennant's 14th Doctor, it was all about why has his face come back. We had the Timeless Child. Then in Peter Capaldi era, there was initially a sort of him being a good man and stuff, but I think that kind of went away. It's not always necessarily the Doctor's arc, because sometimes it's just a wizard. Obviously, last year was very focused on Ruby Sunday and her parentage, and that was the arc, that was the personal drama level of it. And then this year with Ncuti Gatwa, the whole arc was returning home and the ever-present Mrs. Flood watching over that. So yeah, he hasn't had a narrative arc for his Doctor, but I think also just in his character vibe, it's very much like either the Wizard of Oz or Willy Wonka style, an entryway into a weird universe that you can come into. So I quite like that his Doctor it's always about the people who travel with him as opposed to his internal thing, because he's such an external one. He was very emotive and very open, and wouldn't be the sort of Doctor that would keep any secrets. It wouldn't be done for personal reasons. It may be a secret, say, if he knew how someone was going to die, he would have to not reveal that. But he seems a sort of Doctor that wouldn't, whereas, say, Jodie Whittaker's one was very emotionally closed off and wouldn't share. As we discover in this series, that's kind of part of the reason this Doctor's the way he is as kind of a flip side. So I quite like that his openness doesn't really leave as much space for inner conflict, as it were, because he's so expressive and he would share it. He would ask his companion, he'd get their thoughts and stuff. So I quite like that this one's been just seeing stuff, just running to the next thing, as opposed to having something to follow.
I would maybe push back a little bit against this. One of the things I actually really liked about this season is I like Millie Gibson. Ruby is a fairly decent introductory companion, but she is a young woman and she is somebody who is presented as a teenager or in her 20s, depending on when you join her in the stories. And putting Belinda in the TARDIS gives you a character who can push back at this Doctor. And you can even see it arguably with Joy and Joy to the World as well. The 15th Doctor, and I think it's a very well-observed character beat, is that the 15th Doctor has been through therapy, but there is a recurring sense in the Davies cynicism about human nature way that therapy has perhaps made him worse. Therapy has allowed him to justify doing the stuff that he normally does. You have that moment in the Robot Revolution where he scans her DNA without telling, and the moment where he gives her the big speech about coming on adventures, and Belinda's like, oh, by the way, did you give that to the companion who died earlier in this episode? Is that what you do? You're dangerous. You have the moment in The Well where he's talking to Belinda in front of Alice, and he turns his back on Alice and says, be careful with her. And Alice is like, I can read lips, you know, at which point he just changed and goes, oh, great, fantastic. I'm glad you could do that. That's amazing. There is this sense of the 15th Doctor as somebody who is very cheerful, but who is also insanely manipulative and dangerous and has an edge to him that comes from somebody who has been, well, I have been through the ringer, and I am perfectly fine now, and I do not have to do any sort of personal interrogation about who I am. I just have to accept me as I am. You mentioned Tennant. That is very much the Davies way of writing Tennant, the Davies way of writing 15, where, unlike, say, Eccleston's first Doctor, by virtue of being the first season of the revival, unlike Smith's Doctor, who I think has an arc in terms of his relationship to women, unlike Capaldi, who I think has a very clear arc in terms of realizing what it means to be a good man, both in terms of being a good person and being a good man. Whittaker, you arguably have the Timeless Child in terms of of 14, you have Why Is the Face Back? But there is this element of Davies just being, I will add complications and nuance to the character, and I will just not interrogate them whatsoever. They are not part of an arc. They are just part of who this guy is. His torturing of Kid in the Interstellar Song Contest, for example. It's trademark Davies Doctor stuff. It is not too dissimilar from the way that the 10th Doctor punishes the Family of Blood at the end of Family of Blood. It is, you wronged me, you crossed my path, you upset me, you caused harm to people that I care about, therefore I am justified in doing the most horrible thing imaginable to you. And the show is like, this is just who he is. He's fire and ice in the heart of the sun. And I think that that is something that Davies does. Your mileage may vary. Sometimes I like it when it is intentionally ambiguous. Sometimes I don't like it when it feels like the show doesn't interrogate or engage with it. But I do think you're entirely right that the 15th Doctor does not have an arc. But I do think that in this season, when you pair him with Joy, you pair him with Belinda, he gets a bit more edge and a bit more nuance, and he feels more particular as a Doctor than he did, I think, in his previous season, where Ruby in some ways felt like a default companion. And I think Gatwa, as charming as he is, and he's an incredibly charismatic performer, I think in his first season he felt like the default Doctor. It doesn't help that he was absent for large portions of that season due to outstanding commitments. You even get a Doctor Light episode here. But I do think this season does a much better job of making this version of the character more nuanced and complicated, even if it doesn't necessarily give him a clear beginning, middle, and end arc. That said, I do like that the show has some thematic concerns about the character. Davies has a very clear vision of what this show is, where it is about lost children, and the 15th Doctor, I think it's nice that his first full adventure is about him reuniting a lost child with her mother, and his final adventure is hastily reshot so that it is him reuniting a lost child with her mother. I do think that there is an interesting gesture towards thematic cohesion across the show, but it is not an arc. To get back to the conversation about season finales and the role of modern television, it is episodic storytelling, but it is a character, not a character arc, if that makes sense, I would argue.
Yeah, and the weirdest thing is I found that there was sniffs of a potential arc in there. You had him connecting with Ruby over the fact that they were both effectively foundlings in the previous season. They don't really do much with that. Then you have this whole idea of last of the Time Lords, that thing they keep bringing up, even though he's definitely not last of the Time Lords. He's arguably first of the Time Lords, which is something that they don't bring up at all, even though they're talking about it's Omega, it's the first of the Time Lords. Isn't that you?
I was waiting for the vault to open and reveal the Doctor, to be honest. I was waiting for it to be the Valeyard or some sort of fan wanky nonsense like that.
But it seems like there was an idea of, and maybe this was planned for a third series if they ever got one. We don't know if they're getting one or not at this point, but maybe it was going to loop around to the whole fact about the Doctor being reunited with someone and making some kind of reckoning with his past or where he came from, because that is still a lingering question, even though Davies chooses not to ignore it, even though he easily could have. And I think a lot of people would have liked it if the whole timeless child thing had just never been mentioned again, but he deliberately makes it part of the text. But it's also not something the Doctor's searching for, although people keep kind of threatening him with the answers, which is a bit strange.
What's thematic? One of the things I actually do really like about the Davies 2 era, for all that people have criticized it, again, it is Davies style. It is not tightly plotted. It is not cleanly structured. It is not immaculately plotted, but it does have core thematic concerns. Pretty much every story that Gatwa is in some way about lost children. The Church on Ruby Road is about Ruby being lost and separated, kidnapped by goblins. Space Babies is about the space babies being abandoned at a baby farm. The Devil's Court is about Maestro, the child of the celestial toy maker. Boom opens with a young girl looking for her dead father, again, another absent figure. 73 Yards, you got Ruby and stuff like that. Dot and Bubble, you have the kids being sent to an alien planet away from their parents. Rogue, I got nothing on. The Legend of Ruby Sunday, and then Empire of Death. Even in Empire of Death, you have him meeting the mother, Fiona O'Shaughnessy. And here, obviously, you have Joy to the World, where Joy is traumatized by the fact that she did not get to say goodbye to her mother. The Robot Revolution, it turns out to be retroactively about a mother being separated from her child, but you also have the ending with the sperm and the egg and stuff, and you have the little lost boy who's Alan in there. You have Lux, which is the first adventure they go on. They're drawn into the story there by a mother who is looking for her child who has disappeared in a cinema. In The Well, the first thing that Alice says is, "You have to take me home. I have a daughter waiting for me. She's being minded by her grandparents." As clumsy as the reality war may be, feels like a very clear statement of intent. Lucky Day, obviously you have Conrad, who is a child who has a chance encounter with a doctor, and it really messes up his life. In the story in the engine, you have the daughter of Anastasia, Debassi, I think it is, but who is this child who is trying to avenge herself on her father, who was neglectful and cruel and wanted to pawn her off. In the Interstellar Song Contest, you literally have the antagonist who is named Kid. And you have Belinda actually say, oh, like a baby goat. No, as in a child whose mother died before she could name him. And obviously then you get into Wish World and Reality War and you have Poppy and Belinda. There is a very clear, it is not an arc, but it is a thematic through line to this run of episodes. Davies is singularly preoccupied with the idea of children and parents who have been separated. And to your point, I think that is a really great way of folding the timeless child into Doctor Who. And I think it is worth acknowledging it isn't just the timeless child he folds in. Davies is very careful to make sure that the Chibnall era is remembered. It's not treated as an anomaly or a hole or a lacuna in Doctor Who memory. In The Story in the Engine, you have Joe Martin return as the fugitive Doctor, for example. It is Jodie Whittaker who helps Gatwa through his regeneration in the Reality War. There is a certain magnanimity, I think, for Davies towards the Chibnall era of being like, this is all one thing that fits kind of nicely together. Obviously, he brings in Moffat to write one episode in each season, but I think it is very interesting that Davies is like, I will find a way that, for me, works to integrate the timeless child into Doctor Who, and that is to focus on the emotional idea of what it means for a child to be lost looking for their parents. And I actually think it's a really clever, really interesting idea that runs through every episode of the Gatwa era. Apologies to listeners for just literally speed running every episode of the era, but I think it is thematically important to say this is something on Davies' mind.
Yeah, and if you look at the TARDIS as being the sentient being that helps the Doctor by guiding them to whatever adventure is going to be relevant to them at that point, it could be the TARDIS is taking him to all these adventures that will support that thing that's on his mind.
Or that will hint at what's happening to, again, we'll probably get into it when we talk about the finale, but what's happening with Belinda, where her child has been erased from reality. So her first two adventures are she goes to a mother whose child has disappeared, lost into a cinema, and being at home babysit by her grandparent. And again, I don't think Davies is a master storyteller who's got a corkboard with all this red twine in it. I just think he has these thematic interests that rubble through the stories in really interesting ways. That was a very enthusiastic rabble. Like, maybe I'm not as sick as I thought I was.
And they do some other interesting things with him. They directly address the race thing. It wasn't that they were reluctant to do it last season because you had Dot and Bubble where they don't listen to him because he's black. But in this one, I need to worry about segregation and all this when I'm in certain time periods. And it's just this idea of he can tear apart regimes on alien planets, but he can't stop segregation in the 1950s because that would divorce the show from our reality too much. Whereas if he topples a fascist regime somewhere else on another planet, that's fine.
Yeah, he can't topple Thatcher, he can topple Helen A. And again, just in terms of structure, it's worth noting that the seasons have a clear mirroring of one another, and it's something that Davies used to do in his first one as well. His first season would open with 3 episodes, present, past, future generally. Then you'd have the toyetic 2-parter, then you have a bunch of episodes in the middle, you have the adult 2-parter, typically written by Moffat, then you have the season finale and that sort of stuff. You have a clear structure. And it is interesting that watching these 2 seasons back to back, the episodes are very clearly paired with one another. Space Babies and the Robot Revolution are this kind of retro futurist adventure. The Devil's Cord and Lux are these experimental stories. Experimental and fourth wall breaking. One is a musical and one is the Doctor meets his fans through the power of television. Boom and The Well are both hard science fiction, militaristic science fiction stories, to the point where I'm fairly sure they use the same gun props in both of them. 73 Yards and Lucky Day are both Ruby has to get by without the Doctor. You mentioned the idea of dealing with race in The Story in the Engine. Dot and Bubble is at the same point in that season. They're both the 5th episodes. Rogue and the Interstellar Song Contest are both a show dealing with the Doctor's queerness, metaphorically and literally, in terms of obviously with Rogue in Rogue, but also in terms of this is about Eurovision in the Interstellar Song Contest, but also more broadly about the Doctor's relationship to television, where Rogue is we're crashing the Doctor into fan culture and Bridgerton, and the Interstellar Song Contest is we're writing an episode that is presumably going to air between the FA Cup final and Eurovision, as long as the FA Cup final doesn't go into extra time. And then obviously you have the 2-part finale, which neatly mirrors themselves as well. I don't know if it's conscious, but I like that Davies, rather than trying to compress his 13-episode structure into 8 episodes, has come up with a new 8-episode structure for the show where the episodes are in conversation with one another. And to your point about race, I think it's very telling that he does make a point to bring in writers of colour to deal with that experience, maybe dealing with the fact that Davies himself isn't ideally suited to deal with that, because of course he isn't, because by his own account, he's a middle-aged white man. Inua Ellams is just a fantastic writer, and it's kind of incredible to have him write an episode of Doctor Who. I think that stuff is very consciously part of the conversation. Also worth noting, this is the first TARDIS team entirely of colour, if I'm not mistaken, at least in the show, yeah?
Yeah.
And is kind of about that, to your point. It does actually deal with that. Belinda and the Doctor are wandering into stories which are not normally welcoming to people of color. The Robot Revolution is very transparently Star Wars. The counselor who's like, Alan, are you sure you want to do this, is dressed like a literal Jedi. Very famously, you had the observation of the original trilogy that Lando was the only black person. The Well, much like Boom, is a very militaristic science fiction. It's like Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. Again, not a place you normally see queer people or people of color. I think the show is engaged with that idea without being particularly heavy-handed or clumsy about it. And to your point, I love that moment in Lux where they have that conversation of, this is segregation, this is not what I do, I'm a character in a fictional TV show, there are limits to my power and my ability to change things. I think it's a very clever way of addressing what was, for me, one of the things I butted up against with episodes like Rosa, or even Spyfall Part 2, which is if you're putting the Doctor in that situation where the Doctor is meeting these historically significant people, but not helping them, that makes sense textually because you understand it's an episode of television and you understand it would be disrespectful for the Doctor to help Rosa Parks organize her protest. But it also does not make sense in terms of the fictional world of the show. The only way to round that out is to understand that Doctor Who is a fictional TV show. And I think that is kind of what Davies does, where it's very telling that Lux is the one that has the Doctor literally crash through the viewer's television set. I think that's very clever on the show's part.
I think in terms of like when they did it in the Chibnall ones, because he was more edutainment focused. So a lot of the historical celebrities he'd meet would be lesser known, so like Mary C. Cole or Noreen Yat Khan. And in some cases, they're all involved in very turbulent and tragic times. So it's kind of like, he's meeting all these people. They're not really doing too much to help. Like poor Noreen Yat Khan is destined to follow her own history.
Yeah, you're going to die in a concentration camp. Let me wipe your memory. And I understand why that's happening. It's a piece of television. But as a character in a drama, I'm like, whoa, we need to unpack this.
Well, yeah, so it is important. Her story, she's a very heroic person in that war, and it's worth telling and educating people about. But yeah, also it's sort of double-edged sort of going, but we can't do anything about it. In the Ncuti Gatwa, the historical people haven't really been as big of a... Because that was essentially introduced by Rusty Davies. It wasn't really a thing in the past. But well, other than the Beatles, I don't think there's anyone this year.
Graham Norton, obviously. Graham Norton, obviously a historical character.
Oh, Graham Norton, yeah, and Rylan.
Rylan, yes. Rylan, who clearly had himself frozen on the 23rd of May or something.
He saw it was coming. The Rani was like, we must preserve Earth culture.
Through Rylan.
Through
He'll
Rylan.
just be presenting Eurovision for the rest of his life. He'll live one day at a time, so he'll be able to do it for like 1,000,000 years, but he will eventually die doing this. Yeah, there wasn't any real historical celebrities this season. Certainly not narratively important ones. And Darren, you talking about the approach in Spyfall. I just remember the Doctor saying to the Master when he's wearing a Nazi uniform,
now they'll see you for who you really are.
This is the worst thing you've ever done, or something like that. It doesn't even crack the top 1,000 of the worst things he's ever done.
Yes, obviously in terms of the world of the show, he has wiped out entire fictional universes full of people, but also you put him in a Nazi uniform and that means something different. I'm a big fan of, for all its problems, Let's Kill Hitler, where the idea of that episode is we can't do anything with Hitler, so we'll put him in the closet and do Indiana Jones, which is metatextually for me the way that you deal with that. We cannot do anything about Hitler. This is a fictional TV show. It is not a real time travel thing. And to Isaac's point, I think Davies' era too owes a lot to the Moffat era in a variety of ways. There's a really good article that was written on Tor.com, and I wish I could remember who wrote it, but they made the observation that one of the big things that happens over the course of the Moffat era is Moffat moves away from the celebrity historical. So obviously in his first season he has Winston Churchill, he has Vincent as well. He has these real historical figures, but as this Moffat era progresses, you get the Doctor interacting with fictional characters like Santa Claus or Robin Hood, for example. And the idea is that this is the realm in which the Doctor makes sense. He's a fictional, magical character who can interact with Santa Claus and can interact with Robin Hood or whatever, but probably not a great idea to put him next to Churchill. That raises all sorts of questions that the show's not ready to handle. And I do think, to your point about there being a lack of historical celebrities, I think the Davies era too is about the idea of media. And you mentioned the idea of the Beatles are really the only historical celebrities who appear in there. I think that's very telling because they are cultural icons rather than political or social icons, or as much as they're social icons, they're cultural icons. The show does seem to be about what it means to be Doctor Who. There is this recurring preoccupation throughout the era with television, the idea of television and broadcast television. Davina McCall is the big historical celebrity who appears in the church on Ruby Road, for example. But you have in Dot and Bubble, we mentioned in Rogue, you have Bridgerton, for example. In The Legend of Ruby Sunday, they step into a literal video cassette where the snow is the static on the cassette. In Lux, they push through a television set and break into people's living room. In The Robot Revolution, Al reinvents that world to make it more like his video games, and in doing so to make it more like 50s hard science fiction. Even the Interstellar Song Contest is about Eurovision. It's not about a historical event. It's about this huge cultural moment for TV. And even something like The Story in the Engine, which is about the idea of this web of stories and mythology and things that we talk about which are fiction. And I think that is something that Davies is preoccupied with in his second run. I think the rejection of historical figures is quite intentional, and I think it is Davies is kind of trying to figure out, or maybe he's trying to figure out, this is just my reading of it, but it feels to me like Davies is trying to figure out how to use Doctor Who for good, for lack of a better word. Is Doctor Who a social good? Is it a social utility? And it's the way that the Doctor is a social utility isn't that he, to your point, saves Rosa Parks or kind of can or anybody like that, because he can't. He's not a real person. The way the Doctor is a social good is that he speaks to people through the stories that are told about him. Most obviously in The Story in the Engine, he speaks to them through culture. He speaks to them in the hour before Eurovision, or he comes into their living rooms and talks to them directly. And I think that that is something that Davies is very interested in. I think we talked about it last year. Davies' big thing has been talking about the state of the BBC. This is a nice dovetail into talking about the state of the show later on, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But Davies' big fear that the BBC is going to cease to exist in the form that it does at the moment. And to Isaac's point about edutainment, the difference between the BBC and a for-profit television network is profound. The BBC sees itself as a socially useful broadcaster, and British television in particular has a long history of being socially relevant, where you have Up the Junction changes attitudes on abortion, Kathy Come Home changes attitudes on homelessness. Even this year you have adolescence being shown to Parliament and being argued it should be shown in schools. There is this tradition that exists in British culture, which I don't think translates directly into American television, of treating art as something that can make a difference to the world as people see it and understand it. And I think that is maybe what Davies is playing with Doctor Who, which is the idea the Doctor is fictional, but that doesn't mean he can't make the world a better place, maybe.
Interesting how each different showrunner, as much as I do enjoy the Chibnall era, he was maybe a little too rosy glasses.
We need Amazon. It's just we need to make it a better system rather than destroy this awful thing.
The system isn't the problem.
I meant more in terms of back in, when he was watching Doctor Who as a kid, the Doctor would turn up with their friends, meet a monster, solve the problem, zoom on their adventures, and I think he was looking for more of a show you could watch episode 2, watch episode 6. And then he obviously moved back to that at the end with the serialized Flux. But I think so initially, one of the big things was it feels more like you could watch series 11 out of order. Some of it even feels like they have put it in out of order. I remember watching Witchfinders, which I think is episode 9 or 8. And it's the first one where she kind of butts up with, oh, historically, I can't really do stuff. Have you not noticed this for like half a series? You're not got this skill anymore, or this easy access. And say with Stephen Moffat as well, so talk about like celebrity historicals, where the whole thing was always meeting Charles Dickens, Agatha Christie, and people that have been inspiring. It's like, okay, who's the worst? Hitler. Because sometimes there's awful people in history, and then same with the hybrid. Sometimes arcs, you're expecting a half Dalek, half human thing, whereas it can just be, I know, it's just the Doctor and their companion, and stories can snowball or they can be interpreted with different time and stuff. So I think Stephen Moffat's series also twisted on what had been built up as Russell Davies's more traditional 4 series and a special things you expect there. The celebrity historical with Charles Dickens or Queen Victoria being involved, and the evil character pulling the strings this whole time. So switching that around. And I think Russell Davies's second run's probably the most respectful in terms of who's come before. So even with the Moffat era and the Chibnall era, wrapping them in, it's felt much more, it's all one big show, whereas say initially with Matt Smith's first series, the episodes like The Stolen Earth, conveniently it's disappeared into a cracking time. Or I think with the Master being back in the Chibnall era, we're not really going to address that whole big story you had mere moments ago for yourselves, the Misc arc, just back to the Master doing Master stuff. Whereas straight away into Russell Davies's 60th specials, we had stuff like The Flux has really messed the Doctor up, and The Timeless Child, and we have Moffat, who was very good at making the universe feel large, would have Villengard, and that whole feeling of this is a working universe that we're travelling in and not individual things bring in. So I think he's been the best at making it feel like, even though this is Disney Series 1 and Series 2, it's not a solid reboot. Everything is still going on, and I think he's had a better balance of making it feel that way.
Well, Isaac, on that, it is a point of controversy that this was launched as season 1. It's a good jumping on point for new viewers. And you're getting Sutek and you're getting Omega and you're getting the Rani. I don't mind it too much because I think the show does a decent enough job of explaining who these people are and what they mean. They do the same thing with the Rani in Wishworld that they do with the Master in Utopia, where they count on the Doctor reacting to the name to convey to you how big a deal this character is. Isaac, do you think there is an issue there in terms of, as a jumping on point? Is that level of continuity potentially alienating for a show that was launching on Disney Plus worldwide, having a bigger platform than Doctor Who had arguably ever had.
It doesn't help that Disney didn't have access to any of the back catalogue.
Yeah.
Oh, look, we've got a sequel to Midnight. You could go watch it if you subscribe to another streaming service in the US.
We'll split the difference and we'll give you some clips from it. Yeah.
I think it's a bit of a problem of it's still a massive franchise and there will be people like us who are watching it. So they could make it more of a harder reboot. All the monsters are new. No past companions, no past people turning up. Then you get essentially Series 11 again or stuff like that where monsters may not necessarily get the big draw and there's going to be people going, where's the Daleks? Where's this? And people want, well, maybe not necessarily characters like the Rani or Omega, but with the return of Sutek and stuff. It's still a show that is 60-ish years old and then it started again with the 60th special, which was not a jumping on point at all because it was series 4.5, ending with a 60s villain that only exists in about 25 minutes.
In an episode that doesn't exist, yes.
Yeah, so you can't go like, oh, we're doing 3 episodes and then just ignore all of that and we'll start again because there's the screaming voices of Twitter. Well, there's always a sense of fan ownership and things. And if it felt whole and new and for everyone, then everyone who's watching it for ages, some of them would kick off and say, they're not making it for me anymore. Same with a lot of, I don't watch Star Trek, but definitely so to Star Wars. You got Dave Filoni Star Wars bringing in characters from annuals and things, and it's very difficult to watch not knowing who this character of the week is in Ashoka and characters from the prequels and stuff coming back. But then they do stuff like The Acolyte, which is almost exclusively separate. Not saying that Acolytes, poor responses due to entirely being new, but they're scared of, or not scared of, but it's a balance of what people want, what they know, and they also want new things, but they want 100% of both. So I think every Doctor's jumping on point. I think that's one thing Doctor Who has. So even if you were jumping on with Matt Smith or Peter Capaldi or Jodie Whittaker, any of them, it's always handy because it's little chunks. It's not like, say, trying to read Marvel comics, which is impossible. Sometimes people go, okay, let's start with Peter Capaldi, or start with David Tennant 1 and jump in there. There is always little jumping in points, which is, I think, one of the reasons the show has managed to last such a long time. Because it does always refresh all the time. But I think making it a Disney jumping on point, a global jumping on point, the fact that they still use the Rani Omega, flashes of Sutek, Susan, stuff like that, still an ongoing story. It's nice to have that universe still feel like there's other stuff around because people do kind of expect returning characters. It's still part of the fun.
Can I just say also, I do love that Gatwa, and I know Gatwa has said himself he would be very disappointed if he finished being Doctor Who without facing a Dalek, which is now ironic given he ended up being Doctor Who without facing a Dalek. But I love that these 2 seasons don't have the Daleks, the Cybermen, or the Master in them. For all that we talk about continuity and fan service and history, I kind of like that Davies did 2 seasons of Doctor Who that do not have the big 3 villains in them, which is interesting to me. I think somebody pointed out that Dan Lewis, who is only a companion for a total of 8 episodes, is in episodes with the Master, the Daleks, the Cybermen, the Santarans, the Sea Devils. I quite like that to a certain extent this is more niche. Sutek is the absolute bottom of the barrel that you can go to in terms of nostalgic revivals. The Celestial Toymaker is the bottom of the barrel in terms of nostalgic revivals. Omega is the bottom of the barrel. There's a real sense of we're trying to do this without using the big Doctor Who villains, and so you end up with legitimately surreal choices, which I do kind of like, even if I'm sympathetic to the understanding of imagine watching these 2 seasons as your first season of Doctor Who.
In terms of jumping on points, I think that the only pure jumping on point that we've had is the 2005 series. I feel like everything else assumes some level of familiarity with the show. And the fact that it's a continuous show, them calling this a soft reboot when it started less than a year after the previous era is ludicrous. So restarting the numbering, I know it's the beginning of the Disney era, but the 2005 series, it gives you in 13 episodes a kind of Spark Notes version of Doctor Who. Everything you need to know in order to understand Doctor Who. You have the Doctor, you've got the TARDIS, you have the Companion, there's the Daleks, and then it ends in a regeneration. In 13 episodes, you get a digest of absolutely everything you need to know about Doctor Who. And then you move into the David Tennant era where it's, okay, now you get it. Now you understand what the concept is. Now we can play around with its history.
K9, Sarah Jane, Cybermen, the Master.
Yeah, all that. But the thing is, I never found, because I didn't watch the original show, I never found any of the returning stuff in Davies 1.0 alienating because I felt like they were all servicing the story that was being told in that episode. But the difference here between the Master's return in Utopia and the Rani's return here is I felt like the Master was more connected to what was going on than the Rani was in this. And I felt like the Doctor's reaction sold more of why I should care than this does. All I was thinking when the Rani shows up in this season is, how is this any different to the Master? And then you have Mel saying, she treats the universe like a big experiment. I'm like, okay, are you going to start showing me that at any point? Because I'm not seeing it. And then you've got Omega, first of the Time Lords. Yeah, we fought them in the 70s. Okay, why should I care? But in terms of when the Daleks get brought back in Davies 1.0 for the first time, the Cybermen are a completely new riff on the idea when he first brings them in. And the Master, you understand, evil Time Lord, the Doctor has to defeat. Fine, easy enough. And then you have the other villains that get piled on as you go on, the Sontarans. Even then, that story is very much about what's happening in that moment. And the Doctor only really says, oh yeah, I fought them before, and this is what they do. And then you get shown that they do it, which I don't think is the case here. And I just think that it must be possible to just come up with a major threat that isn't one from 40 years ago and play with that. As far as I'm concerned, it's the same thing because I don't understand the relevance.
They're done exactly the same way. People were online complaining that the big set that Davies uses in The Giggle and in Empire of Doom and in Reality War is the unit headquarters. That is the same set that Davies used as the Valiant Bridge in Season 3 or the Game Station in Season 1 or Torchwood 1 in Season 2. It is a big open space that serves to allow the characters to come together for the finale so the Doctor can do a Deus Ex Machina to shove the threat back where it came from. Functionally, they are the same. Sutekh is used the same way that the Daleks are used in Doomsday, for example. In Reality War, arguably, Omega's used the same way as Sutekh was the previous year, because that's how Davies does finales. I think I talked about last year, but I think there is an interesting tension with Davies 2 and continuity, where there is this question of, is continuity something that haunts us and bogs us down? Is it something that kind of traps us? Where you have the Doctor being haunted by Susan, who is the first companion of the show, given that Carol Ann Ford is at a certain age and this feels like the last chance to bring her back. And it is kind of tragic that the last chance to bring her back will be her saying Doctor into a television set. But you have like The Well, which brings back the Creature from Midnight, but it brings back the Creature from Midnight with an entirely new set of rules, and where the Creature from Midnight is quite literally now the embodiment of continuity. It is this thing that walks behind you that you cannot see, that is always with you like a shadow, and which is potentially lethal and dangerous. But that feels to me like a metaphor for the fear of continuity and the weight of continuity pushing down. It's the same thing with Empire of Death. I don't think Davies does it particularly well in the Reality War, but I do love that in both Empire of Death and the Reality War, Davies brings back this big mythic past of Gallifrey and this idea of lore and continuity. I'm watching the Reality War as a Doctor Who fan, and I'm like, is he going to canonize Looms? That is the threat running through the back of my mind. Is Davies going to canonize Looms from the Wilderness years? And instead, he quite literally just has Omega pick up the Rani, swallow the Rani, and get shoved back in a door, which is closed after them. And to your point, Craig, the way to critique that sort of storytelling is arguably just not to do it, not to indulge in that sort of fan servicey continuity nonsense. You can make a new villain that could fill that role, but I do think that the show is very clumsily and very flawed. Engage with that idea of, this is a show that has a past and a history behind it, where Sutekh is death, and Sutekh uses the TARDIS to spread death across the cosmos, and anywhere the Doctor returns to, he will have killed. It will have already been dead. He cannot go back. Sutekh is attached to the TARDIS. He is the past. He is death. He is entropy. He is decay. He's living inside an old VHS cassette, quite literally. And I think that there is an element of that with Omega, and it's the same thing that Davies did. Again, Davies is just constantly recycling the same ideas, and I get that is frustrating for some viewers, but part of me is also like, it's nice to see a storyteller iterate over ideas. But it's the same concept as End of Time Part 2, which is this idea of Gallifrey as the representative of lore and continuity in Doctor Who, and the idea that it is looming large over the horizon, and that the big threat at the end of the Davies era is the resurrection of Gallifrey. Is that Gallifrey is going to come back, and it's going to bring back all the lore and all the continuity with it, and then End of Time just manages to pull the rug out from under it, and it's like, actually, we don't want to do that. We do not want to bring back Gallifrey. We do not want to do Arc of Infinity again. And there is an element of that to the Reality War, where it sets up this big idea of lore and Time Lords and mythology and looms and Omega and the Rani, and it just pulls the rug out from under it and becomes this story about a lost mother and a lost child, which I like in theory. I just really wish the execution were better.
It's interesting when we talk about continuity as well within Doctor Who and how inconsistent it can be. Watching Joy to the World, that episode that acknowledges that COVID happened, but then we had episodes of Doctor Who set during COVID times and there was no evidence of COVID. So it's one of those things that didn't happen at a point and now happened again. And it's just, well, I think Moffat's approach is he'll pull on whatever he needs to do in order to tell his story. But at the same time, it's this idea of you can't really trust the show's narration of its own timeline because it's always contradicting itself.
And quite literally with Belinda. That is the entire arc of Belinda over the course of this season. It's revealed, Darren says in the final episode, I'm aware of the production difficulties and the fact that it was reshoots, the fact it was a kind of hacked together to give the story a satisfying ending resolution. But the culmination of that arc is that you have been watching an edited version of Belinda over the course of the season. That she was always going home to Poppy, and you are only now seeing everything that actually happened. The show is again altering its own continuity in history, and the version you've been seeing is the edited 1 degree off reality version of what is happening, where she has to get home for 7:30 a.m. because her shift starts, but you assume that it's a shift at work, but it is a shift at childcare.
When she lives with flatmates as well in the first episodes.
Rather than in this nice terraced house in the finale. And again, I give the show credit. I think Davies is playing with the idea of continuity. You have the insertion of the Shelka Doctor in Rogue, for example. There's another similar example of that this season. I can't remember what it is. Oh, they played clips from Dimensions in Time when they're reintroducing the Rani in Wishworld. There is this sense of everything counts, but if everything counts, it is all internally inconsistent and contradictory, and therefore there is no way to make these fit together, and so you're going to end up with, to your point, contradictions and misunderstandings and continuity and time being rewritten. I like the Moffat approach of time can be rewritten, don't ask any questions, but I do also admire that Davies is like, no, it's all true, all of it's true, even the stuff that contradicts the other stuff, that is also true.
I like that Doctor Who's a show very much is. Anything's canon if you like it, essentially. It's like whichever you choose. This is a real tangent. I've got a weird Arc of Infinity tangent that I just like bringing up because I think it's very funny. I watched it again recently. I've not seen the initial Omega story, which I think is the Three Doctors.
The Three Doctors, yeah.
I'm not watching much John Pertwee stuff, but what I love about Arc of Infinity is my favourite villain defeat, I think, in all science fiction. Omega being a being of a different dimension where there is no matter. It's formless. You can take whatever form you like, be it a giant big skeleton man, or as he looked in the classics, a big sort of warrior man.
With a frowny face.
With a big frowny face.
Listeners can't see I'm doing the frowny face gesture.
But in Arc of Infinity, essentially he wins his freedom into our universe in the body of the Peter Davison Doctor who's just turned 30, essentially. And being 30 kills him. It's like, oh, my back and my knees and breathing and being hungry. And over the course of the episode, he's just sort of stumbling around Amsterdam and like, ow. He just lives to death. He just experiences life and it's like, oh, life, this is horrible.
Very relatable.
Yeah, we do this all the time. It's like, oh, this is horrible. I should have lived in my universe of nothingness.
I do love the idea that the baby Omega from the Reality War is what happens if you let Peter Davison go off, by the way.
I thought it'd be amazing if the door opened and Peter Davison just rocks out. He just turned up to Dave Film. He's like, hello, I'm Omega again. My theory, Anita Dobson, who was Mrs. Flood, who regenerates into the Rani. I've always wondered, was this originally that she was just going to regenerate? Because of one of the criticisms would be that Mrs. Flood's not the most traditionally Rani, whereas Archie Punjabi's one is very much a Rani. Oh, we did that though with Derek Jacobi in The Master, so we can't have the classical actor killed off again. And I think also Russell Davies loves soap operas, and he has essentially the gold standard of soap opera actors. Like, we can't get rid of Anita Dobson. We have to keep her around.
The entire Rani plot builds to a two Ronnies punchline, which is the kind of thing that just conceptually I say the Reality War doesn't work, and I think the first 40 minutes of the Reality War are to me unforgivable, but it builds to a two Ronnies joke, and I'm like, okay, you get that one. That one I'll allow you. Because he loves television. And he's talked about it how one of his big bugbears with modern television writers is they don't watch enough television, including, to your point, soap operas. And he's like, television should be television. It's very telling that television is such a big part of this season. Obviously, you've got Lux, they crack through the television. You've got Lucky Day, Conrad is a YouTuber, because of course he is. You also have in Wishworld, Conrad is speaking to people through the television set like he's J.K. Rowling. It is a show, I think, about television. Kid in the Interstellar Song Contest is trying to weaponize television using is it a delta wave?
The Delta Wave.
Which is from The Parting of the Ways, another episode in which a television studio is weaponized into a weapon of mass destruction. But I think Davies is like, the power of television is really strong, and I think that is a thematic concern of the show. But yeah, the two Ronnies joke, you get a pass from me on that? Fine, I'll give you the scene. You can have the scene.
I think my finale highlight is Archie Punjabi's entrance into Wishworld, where she's on a hover scooter thing going into her bone palace, and she just popped down the shops. She just turns up and she's like, well, I got the ham.
Palermo ham, yeah.
Yeah, she's just been out to get the ham. He's very good at human drama, and he can turn even the most villainous of entrances into just life, which I thought was a wonderful little thing.
Can I throw a question to Craig and to Isaac on this? Obviously, this is a very troubled season. Behind the scenes, there are all sorts of rumors about reshoots and stuff like that. I generally believe most of those are true. I think the narrative that has been provided makes a great deal of sense.
Well, every single leak was true, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's it exactly.
Every single one of them.
To me, the Rani regeneration at the end of the Interstellar Song Contest feels like a late addition to that story, because the introduction of the Rani in Wishworld is much more effective. It builds to a moment where she says, "I am the Rani," and the Doctor goes, "No, not the Rani," much like he goes, "No, not the Master" in Utopia. The bi-generation scene at the end of the Interstellar Song Contest, was that a late addition? Does that feel like something that was added in post? And was, to Isaac's point, the Rani arriving like a witch, having the Doctor go, "Do you ever wonder who she is?" And then building to the word Rani being said on television. Was the Rani originally supposed to be introduced in Wishworld, do we think?
I know when they introduced Sutek at the end of Ruby Sunday, they showed, and here's a 90-minute abridged version of Pyramids of Mars, the Sutek's story. I know a lot of people didn't like that. I really enjoyed the little post-credit scene with the Rani, but I did all wonder, is this so that people had a week to find out who this was?
You had to Google between the two.
Like, we'll put it in now so you can Google it.
That's the Tony Gilroy approach, isn't it? That's the reason why he put Bail Organa in episode 6 of the second season of Andor, because he's like, the internet needs a week to process the recast before we do anything with the character.
The thing is, I'd heard of the Rani, but I don't really know that much about her. And to your point, Darren, about scraping the barrel of villains, and it's one of those things where Doctor Who fans know who the Rani is, but even people that know, well, I wouldn't say I know Doctor Who that well, but I've seen everything since 2005 and very little of the old show. But I was aware of the Rani. It was mentioned to me a few times or whatever.
Every woman who ever appeared in Doctor Who was going to secretly be the Rani.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with Moffat. Moffat did a big interview, I think, around Clara or around River, where he's like, the Rani is a really stupid idea, because when you say, "I am the Rani," there are 5 people in the entire United Kingdom who will point to the screen and go, "Yes, I know exactly who that is." And I think Moffat is right to say that. And for years, I have been against the use of the Rani in the show for that very reason. I will actually say, as a Rani skeptic, I was actually quite impressed with how the Rani was used here, but I should probably defer to Isaac as the expert in classic Doctor Who.
One thing I've really enjoyed is the first 2 Doctor Who VHSs I had were Time and the Rani and Pyramids of Mars. I love that it's just the ones that I watched when I was 8. They're getting their time.
Is Time and Rani the one where she wears a wig and pretends to be his companion?
She pretends to be Mel specifically.
Yeah, she pretends to be Mel. She builds a big brain. It's very good. I'm a big fan because I watched it when I was like 8. And I was like, this is great. But I have watched it again recently. It's got a soft spot.
I'll say it's not as bad as its reputation.
It's not as bad as its reputation. It's very sort of shown at like 4 p.m.
It's Pippa Jane Baker. We need a new script to open the season and introduce the 7th Doctor. What have you got, and can you get it to us in a week? That's what Time in the Rani is.
They opened Colin Baker's era with the twin dilemma, and they were like, what's the exact opposite of that?
That's fair.
Because that was a disaster. It was like, well, just do it kid-friendly. And for kids, and maybe nobody try and strangle no domestic abuse.
Yeah, no domestic violence in this season, please.
Couldn't Davies have invented a Time Lord villain of his own, though? It could have been a villain that turns up that the Doctor doesn't even know about. They announce themselves as, I don't know what title they could give themselves.
The Professor.
Yeah, I don't know who you are. I've never heard of you.
The Watchmaker or something, anything.
Yeah, that could be interesting, giving the Doctor something completely new, rather than just another old villain that I've never heard of. I think that's fine if the story is going to support this villain being part of it, and then it ultimately becomes not a big deal that it's a returning villain, because the episode tells me exactly everything I need to know about that character for that story. But I don't think they did that, and I also don't think the Doctor and the Rani share much in the way of meaningful interactions. They have like 1 scene together or 2 scenes together, and that's about it.
They have 2 scenes together, one at the end of Wishful, one at the start of Reality War. I would push back a little, again, as this podcast resident Rani skeptic. With respect to Isaac, I am not as fond as Time of the Rani, and I'm not as fond of Mark of the Rani as
no one
Isaac
is.
Yeah, the one time where Darren gets to represent majority Doctor Who opinion on the podcast, and I'm going to enjoy this. But the Rani is, for me, when you watch the classic show, she's very much, we just need another master. She is a mad scientist, but the master is also a mad scientist, and she's mucking around with history, but the master also mucks around with history. And I think what really surprised me about the use of the Rani in Wishworld and Reality War is that it did actually feel feel like Davies was in conversation with how the Rani was used. In the Mark of the Rani, she's traveling back to the Industrial Revolution, and she's there at the dawning of the steam engine, and she is engaged with this idea of technological progress and forward movement, and the idea of what it means for a society to undergo technological revolution and the implementation of capitalism and all that sort of stuff. And in Time in the Rani, she's playing around with time and eggs and petri dishes and all this laboratory stuff. And I think that what I liked about Wishworld is that the show uses her as a mad scientist, yes, which the Master can be, but as a eugenicist, as this person who is very preoccupied with the idea of purity, genetic purity, classic reproduction, the restoration of existing order, where Conrad's world is this suffocating heteronormative world where heteronormative couples and procreation are presented as a manifestation of capitalism. They're a furthering of that idea that you had back in Mark of the Rani, where the Rani is harvesting the sleep cycle of workers in order to enable her planet to continue producing and continuing to be an economic powerhouse and continuing to thrive. And I think that Wishworld and Reality War are extensions of that and in conversations of that, where she has created this world with the assistance of Conrad, where family is very cleanly defined. Procreation is very clearly defined. She has this conversation at the start of Reality War where she's like, no, Poppy doesn't count because Poppy is half Time Lord. She's a mongrel. She's not pure blood. She's not a full Time Lord. But she has this idea of purity and very conventional ideas of heteronormativity. She is disgusted by the idea that she was spun forth from Miss Flood's loins. That sequence in Wishworld where she's standing on the balcony arming what can only be described as penis bombs in her bone palace, while Miss Flood is saying, you are my child in a sense. You could be seen as somebody who spun forth from my loins. You were produced asexually. I am your mother and you do not have a father. And you have the Rani as the penis bomb, the head of it glows red, going, that's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. But you have this idea of the Rani as a eugenicist, a scientist, somebody who is tied to this idea of a very rationalist, capitalist, particularly late capitalist idea of what progress looks like, where people exist to couple off, to produce offspring, and to further the species in a very conventional, very traditional sense, where Omega is going to serve as a gene bank because Omega is the oldest Time Lord and therefore the purest Time Lord. And obviously when we see Omega, he's presented as this kind of monstrous, disgusting, malformed, almost incestuous creature of Time Lord energy that's just been feeding off itself for decades. I do love that somebody's like, what happened to the eagle monster that he used to hang out with in Ark of Affinity? And I'm like, I think I have a good idea what happened to the eagle monster given what he does to the Rani. But I do think the show actually makes a convincing argument for using the Rani ahead of using the Master here. I don't know that I would buy the Master being so, and I want to be careful how I say this, rigorously scientific, Darren says in air quotes, by the standards of a Davies series finale, where there is a very precise plan, and that plan is tied to eugenics and social engineering and heteronormativity and reproduction and the furtherance of the species. I don't know that the Master would work cleanly in that story in the way that the Rani does, at least for me. I say as the resident Rani skeptic.
Yeah, it just didn't work for me. I didn't find that the character was used enough to gather my attention in any way. And like I say, they only have the 2 scenes with the Doctor, and one of them is when the Doctor isn't himself, so they only really have the 1 scene. I suppose you could count a 3rd scene in the Bone Palace, but even then that's more of the, we're about to open the door, and then that's it. There's not much to it. So it just doesn't work for me. And one of those things that I am becoming very tired of is Davies constantly bringing back these villains that were in the old show. The joke was in the previous run that he did that it was always going to be the Daleks, wasn't it? Every time they appear, they're wiped out forever, and then they appear again.
I'm wondering if he got his 3rd season from Disney, would the villain be Kroll? Would the end of season villain for season 16 be Kroll?
Well, I don't know who that is.
I was going to say, good news, they're done. There's no one. They've used all of them now. I guess it's the Valiard, but the Valiard's kind of like the silence. It's so tied into a story, you can't really do anything with them. Too much explaining to do.
I'm sure there's plenty of minor monsters that could come back that don't really matter. I know Davies did that all the time in his previous run. It was things like the Macra. They were in a story before, but it didn't make a difference.
With the Sea Devils, the Zygons and stuff, it's nice having them just sort of show up, not necessarily as the ultimate big threat of the series.
It's a problem we need to solve this week.
Yeah, this week sort of what.
Yeah, which can work, but with the big ones, you can't really get away with that. Well, I suppose you can do what Moffat did to the Daleks and just turned them into a recurring nuisance rather than a universe-ending threat. I found that worked in the main.
Use them as season premiere villains instead of season finale villains, I think is Elizabeth Sander's observation.
Yeah, or there's a story in the middle of the season and they're a problem for that story. I think that was one of the best things he did, was turn the Daleks into just a fact of the universe that people have to get out of the way of. And that's fine. I don't think that every time they came back, they needed to be building a reality bomb or whatever nonsense they were up to during Davies' era.
I wish I didn't have a cold because I could actually earnestly deliver the destruction of reality itself.
And then what do you do? When Sutek wiped out everybody except him, well, now what? You don't have anybody to talk to. Congratulations. You're going to regret this. I suppose we should talk a bit about Belinda, since we've barely really talked about her. I put in the notes, it's more of a question. Is she Martha 2.0 to Ruby being Rose 2.0? And I think there's some element of that. She's a nurse, whereas Martha was a training doctor. She has a pricklier approach to travelling with the Doctor.
Martha was besotted with the Doctor, though.
Yeah, whereas Belinda isn't. But they're both kind of underserved companions in the sense of they're a follow-up to a previous companion, although with Martha, the Doctor was far more, Rose would know what to do, and quite obnoxious about that, whereas he isn't so much with Belinda. He's not constantly comparing her to Ruby. But I think there is a bit of she's a second companion syndrome, if you're looking at it as a soft reboot. I think there's questions around, what do you do with the second companion? How do you make that relevant?
The second companion's job is to iterate to you that the companion is changeable. The first companion is the most important companion because they define the role of companion. The role of the second companion is to remind the audience that these people are largely interchangeable and can be slotted in and slotted out. And there are rumours that Belinda was a rather late addition to this season. The complications that happened, the character had to be cast at the last minute, and that's why she looks like Monday Flynn, which is never really explained outside of the absolute genetic match or whatever line it is the Doctor has in the Robot Revolution. I will say I much preferred Belinda to Ruby. I thought Ruby was very generic companion. I liked Millie Gibson a lot, but I felt like Belinda had a much stronger sense of personality, where she was older and she could push back on the Doctor and she could call him out.
I think they sanded off those edges a bit too quickly, though. She was along for the ride quite swiftly. It was only really the first couple of episodes where she pushed back a bit.
I think even in the Interstellar Song Contest, there are elements of that where she's horrified with the torture, but she has that moment of realization where she's going to die on an alien world thousands of years from Earth. I think there are still elements of that, but I think this is a problem with having only 8 episodes, 2 of which are given to the finale.
A comparison in Doctor Who as a whole, she's more of a Tegan of this modern era.
Well, Tegan is very literally a character who's abducted and tries to get home in the classic Barbara and Ian mold.
Yeah, she's just like, I'm sick of this. I hate this. No one likes anyone in that era. It's fantastic. I quite like that style of character. There's not so much running towards the universe in the way the Doctor is. It's very much they've been caught up in this and they want to get out of it as quick as they can. I agree a bit more with Craig saying that the first 2 episodes have quite a lot of, for example, going against being scanned for DNA. And in looks, they do the dedicated reading. It's like, oh, we can just go. We don't have to stick about. Again, with all series of Doctor Who, or at least the way I see it, you're seeing 8 of X amount of adventures. So the mellowing out is happening around. Obviously, they never say we have to get exactly 8 readings on the Vindicator to succeed. You just have to build them up.
Doesn't seem like there's any gaps between stories, though, does it?
And the nature of the structure of the season, which is Belinda really needs to get home as soon as possible, also doesn't lend itself to the Big Finish gaps. But I'm sure Big Finish, when they get Gatwa and they get Sethu, will figure something out.
They'll try.
They'll get Shooty Gatwa when his Hollywood career is wound down and he finally take their money.
You will be amazed how much stuff happened during Lucky Day. That's my observation or my prediction.
And we also don't know, at least when I was younger, how long does it take for the TARDIS to get to the next place? Is it an overnight? Do they play bananagrams? What do they do in the meantime? And I suppose also one handy thing, compared to, say, Tegan, she had to start a job, she was working at Heathrow, she was an air stewardess. All she wanted to do was just get out of this life and go back to work. And really, there is nothing stopping the Doctor to get at least close to London and book her a cab. Whereas Belinda is stuck. They cannot get to there. So the only way to be able to get to the 24th of May is trust this guy. He seems to know what he's doing.
Could they go back to the 22nd of May and just wait a couple of days?
This is classic the Angels Take Manhattan approach. The Doctor can't visit New York on those 3 days. Well, sure, maybe he can just land somewhere else and take a taxi.
Land in Canada and then cross the border, yeah.
That's it, land in New Jersey. I know landing in New Jersey isn't popular. Sorry to all listeners in New Jersey.
I think there's a line in Lux where they bounce off.
Yes, they bounce off the date.
The week before, I think.
Okay.
Maybe I misheard it. They try going a bit earlier and then bounce off like several decades.
Closest they get is the story in the engine, which is 2018, which is pre-COVID.
Lucky Day, that was like 2006 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was around the time the show had come back. It was the second season of the show.
I think with a show like Doctor Who, it's not a hard science fiction. You have to rely for a little bit of magic. So when they say, for example, we can't save Amy and Rory because of the time bubble or something, you're like, oh, fair. That's fine.
Arthur Darvill and Karen Gillan are very busy right now.
They're really busy. Maybe they're just happy with their new life. It's like, come save us. Like, nah, we'll be out. we'll be at the shops, so sorry. Just not giving her an address or whatever. Yeah, at least with Belinda, she really doesn't have much choice in this series. It is very much the best way home, if you can get home, is with the Doctor and the TARDIS. It's not the case of he's just not taking her home. He's trying his best. It's not like with past ones, Ian and Barbara, William Hartnell's Doctor, where it's like, he's just stubborn. He just doesn't want to. Taking me home is like, nah, London's boring.
It is also implied that part of it is that he can't do it. It is just pretending that he can, or at least that's what I remember from those serials, is the implication that the First Doctor is not as good as he thinks he is at doing stuff. On the Belinda thing, and I do find this interesting, Craig, you mentioned the idea of first and second companions. Part of me does wonder, should Belinda have been the first companion, where Belinda is this character who shows up and is brought into the world of Doctor Who and doesn't want to be in the world of Doctor Who, which is, to your point, it's Tegan, it's Ian and Barbara. It is such an interesting character dynamic of, you have been swept up into the world of Doctor Who. This is alien to you and you do not want to be in Doctor Who. So you have to learn what it means to be in the world of Doctor Who, how it works. The Doctor has to explain to you how it works.
And you convince a new audience why they should like Doctor Who.
That's exactly it. That's the journey that you go on. And you have the contrast between that and Conrad, where Conrad is a hardcore Doctor Who fan and the worst guy in the world, where you have the show being, okay, maybe we need to have a broader tent. Maybe we need to make the case for what Doctor Who is. Maybe we don't need to assume that everybody loves Doctor Who as much as we love Doctor Who. And Belinda being gradually convinced that Doctor Who is pretty great, that it's pretty awesome, that she's having a good time. You have the Doctor in the Interstellar Song Contest basically saying, look, I knew eventually I'd get you. And that feels like the show being, I knew eventually we'd get the fans to actually watch this. We'd finally get the viewer to like Doctor Who, and it took us 6 episodes. I do wonder if Belinda maybe should have been the first companion of the second Davies era or the Disney Plus era, or whatever we're calling it.
Yeah, that could work. And then you go back to traditional with Ruby and maybe your second series. Well, Ruby did serve a purpose in the sense of a traditional companion.
Yes, she needed a lot of stuff explained to her. She was very young and naive. The thing that I do like about Belinda is Belinda's in her 30s, and so she's more knowledgeable, and so she is more skeptical of the Doctor. There was this thing people noticed where the Devil's Cord does the exact same go and get changed and get dressed in costume beat that Lux does. They're even shot from the same angles of the characters running into the room and then cutting to the characters running out of the same door dressed in period appropriate costuming.
And they do it twice this season.
Yeah, and people were like, is Davies just being lazy? Is this him just recycling beats? And maybe it is, but it also feels like the show making the point that Belinda herself makes in the Robot Revolution of, oh, the Doctor has a playbook. The Doctor has a set of moves that he pulls on every companion to win them over, and Belinda is not going to be so easily convinced. I do think there is an interesting tension there. Again, the show only has 8 episodes. The show is not heavily serialized, so it doesn't necessarily get to do it. Belinda is written by a variety of writers. It is very hard for writers who are writing a season sight unseen, having not even seen Gatwa's Doctor, to be honest, given the time that these seasons were filmed, to ask, well, we want you to write the companion. There is the story that Neil Gaiman tells about writing the Cyberman story that he does in season 7, where he's like, when I was writing that, Clara was a Victorian maid. There is this sense of, how do you write a character that you have not seen performed on screen, and where the character concept may be subject to revision in real time as the show is edited and put together. It's very interesting.
I remember reading Moffat talking about that at one point, how he's talking about it's easy to write the Doctor in a story where you don't know which Doctor it's going to be because they're always just the Doctor. So you can make revisions once you know the nuances of that particular incarnation, but the Doctor will always be the Doctor. They'll always adhere to certain rules, whereas the companion can be a problem, can be all over the place. So yeah, I could see Ruby slotting into some of the stories in this season quite easily, apart from, say, the Robot Revolution, which was definitely written as a Belinda episode because it's an introductory episode. You couldn't have had Ruby in that story because it is very much centered around her attitude to it all. And
I do love the idea of Ruby just having bad boyfriend after bad boyfriend. It being a recurring punchline of, well, Al didn't turn out to be too good, but Conrad, he seems like a winner.
Yeah. And Isaac, you were talking about how you think Davies has been raiding your VHS collection. Well, I think he was raiding my ideas, because I talked about years ago, wouldn't it be amazing if you had a Doctor Who season where he was constantly trying to get back to the finale? I mean, that's not quite what happens here, but I had this idea of the first episode starts with him in his battle to the death with the Master, and then the TARDIS whisks them away and they have to have 12 other adventures before they can get back. And the other one was, you buy a star. What if you go to that star system and there's sentient life there, and you could be like, hey, I own you guys, by the way, because I paid 15 quid or something for this certificate.
You say that, though. That is exactly what the season is. He is trying to get Belinda home so she can watch Wishworld on the iPlayer. That is quite literally what he's doing. You need to get me home for 7:30 because it's launching at 8 a.m. on iPlayer. I need to be watching Wishworld.
I want to get my cereal and my cup of tea, and then that's it.
Real world tangent. I've much more preferred 8 a.m. than midnight. Watching at breakfast is so much nicer than staying up till like 1 in the morning.
For me, it didn't really change. That's what I was doing anyway, for the most part. But yeah, it was nice going to the cinema at a reasonable time of night, not midnight.
It is interesting that they managed to get the Reality War pulled off that, where the Reality War did air at the time of the UK television. Because again, this is one of the things with the Davies era or Davies era 2.0, the question of whether Doctor Who is still a television show or whether it's a streaming show that airs reruns on television. Ratings are down across the board, and ratings for Doctor Who aren't necessarily that far down compared to like Britain's Got Talent. If you look at the arc of Britain's Got Talent since 2008, the arc is not that dissimilar from Doctor Who for all the panicking and hand-wringing about it.
It's still top 5 in its time slot, wasn't it, most weeks?
Yeah, and one of the highest scripted dramas on BBC is obviously on top of that you got the merchandising that it makes as well. I'm sure we can talk about when we talk about the future of Doctor Who. The state of Doctor Who and the threat of cancellation of Doctor Who, I suspect has very little to do with ratings or quality of the show and more to do with all due respect to Craig and Isaac, everything that is happening over there, Darren says, gesturing out towards the east coast of Ireland. But I do think that there is an argument to be made about, is Doctor Who under Davies a streaming show that airs reruns on television? And it kind of is interesting that it gets into your point, Craig, and your point, Isaac. Isaac talking about how so much modern Star Wars is very insular and full of fan service and full of references. The reason for that is because it's streaming. It's a streaming show. It's not a broadcast show. Broadcast shows, by definition, have to be broad. They have to cast a wide net and be accessible to my parents.
This is niche casting.
That's it. A streaming show is much more specifically targeted at fans. I do think that is an interesting tension running through Davies 2.0, and I think it is something that people don't really talk about. And it's because we talk about the lore, we talk about the episodes, we talk about the events in the episodes, we talk about the production context, but it does feel like Doctor Who, for these 2 years at least, who knows what's going to happen in the future, was a streaming show that just happened to air a rerun on BBC One on Saturday nights, and almost missed out on doing that in the case of the Interstellar Song Contest, which is completely insane to me.
I do think the show is in a bit of conversation about its own mortality this season as well. You have Mrs. Flood say in the second episode, one night only. It ends on May 24th, and that's the date of
Wish World, but it's the first part of the finale. The finale could be the finale of Doctor Who as a whole. And you have, as you point out, this idea of children as well, which is this idea of the things that replace you.
And then there's the thing about the Interstellar Song Contest airing at the time it did. It's this idea of the time that this story is told is important because it sits in that kind of sweet spot on broadcast TV that makes it special in its own right because of when it airs. And that will never happen again. When you watch it later, you will never appreciate the fact that, oh, they really did this.
You went from the FA Cup final into the Interstellar Song Contest into the Eurovision. You can step even further. I'm wary about doing this because this is an entertainment podcast, but the Interstellar Song Contest is pure television as much as a streaming show because it is an episode that was produced in mid-2023, would have been when these scripts were being finalized, when they were being pitched, when they were being written. According to Davies, by October 2023, most of the scripts for the season were done, and that would include the Interstellar Song Contest. And obviously the episode airs more than a year and a half later in the context of a very different world where the subtext of that episode on broadcast is impossible to read outside the context of what is happening with Israel and Palestine in Gaza. It is impossible to watch the Interstellar Song Contest without parsing it through the lens of what is going on involving Israel and Palestine in Gaza. But when the episode was commissioned and written, obviously that conflict was still ongoing in the Middle East. You couldn't read subtext into Poppy Honey being a reference to the land of milk and honey or whatever. It was clearly on Juno Dawson's mind. But the context of that shifts so dramatically between when the episode was commissioned, written, presumably when it was shot, to when it was aired. And it airs in a completely different world. It is tied, to your point, Craig, so specifically to that moment, even though it was not conceived in that moment. It is this incredible thing about television where you are shooting the head of a needle 1 or 2 years ahead and hoping that you land on the right side of that. Davies very famously saying, to your point about if the FA Cup final goes into extra time, that episode doesn't air before the Eurovision Song Contest. Davies describing it as the sexiest fucking risk. Imagine writing and working on an episode of Doctor Who and not knowing if it would even be broadcast. Again, to talk about Davies as somebody who loves television as a medium, but it is something that to me exemplifies what television is as a medium in a way that theatre and a way that even film isn't, where it is something that exists so specifically in the context of its release and its broadcast, where almost everything else about it, its production context, its initial intent, the world in which it was written, that kind of falls by the wayside because the moment that it is broadcast, it's like it comes into being almost whole and fully formed in a way that is not how things get made. It is so surreal and so particular for me to television as an art form.
And then you have the finale where it airs at that specific time, so everybody is reacting to it at the same time. Everybody sees it at the same time.
In cinemas.
In cinemas or on TV, and everyone floods to social media perhaps afterwards and talks about it at exactly the same time. You don't have this trickle of whatever, and I'm sure people were probably spoiling it as it was airing because, well, you have people like Belinda who are nurses and can't watch it live and have to watch it when they get home or whatever, but broadly speaking, it's on TV and it's being watched at exactly the same time. Although I think they released the regeneration clip like 10 minutes after it aired.
Yeah, to capitalize on that. It is insane. And it's worth noting that the Interstellar Song Contest, the screener went out to critics without the Rani regeneration. So that was a surprise when the episode aired. It is interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah. And Doctor Who's had fun with threats of cancellation before. Colin Baker's last series, which is just called The Trial of a Time Lord. And essentially they were like, we don't know if he's coming back. As much as the character in that story is on trial for his remaining regenerations.
He's literally watching Doctor Who, Isaac. He's sitting down watching episodes of Doctor Who. Yeah.
Yeah, he's watching Doctor Who, and it's like, oh, by the way, if you don't watch this as well, this is it. There's got this sort of meta thing going on around it. They're watching Doctor Who. At the moment, it's like, we've got this many. This might be it. And as much as the Doctor is on trial for his lives, the show's on trial here. Whether or not a big 14-episode story was the best swing for the fence at the time. I mean, it worked for a bit, but I think even Power of the Doctor is very clearly this might be it, so let's do everything. We think this is it. Let's put the Daleks, the Master, and the Cybermen in. It feels very much like if you were to do a big finale for this era, you just do the greatest hits in a big go. The original script, it was just, she goes off, regenerates, we don't see the face, fades to black, and then Russell Davies came in and wrote the regeneration in afterwards. I quite like, not in this narcissistic way, it adds fun when there's a bit of sense of danger to it. At the moment, Doctor Who's not being produced. We don't know what or if the next series will look like in terms of everything, essentially, where it is on, who's writing it, and that sort of stuff. And there's a little bit of excitement.
The sexiest fucking risk, Isaac.
Exactly, but also, and this is the selfish side of this, as Doctor Who fans and I like writing stories, I'm like, oh, if Wilderness Part 2 comes in, great for me, because this is how they got in the first place. It's just a bunch of people in the 90s writing lung barrow and weird looms and all sorts of weird stuff that they could do.
What are looms? It's been brought up twice.
Sorry, Time Lord reproduction, basically. It's the way that Time Lords reproduce.
Right.
Because we don't like to think about the Doctor having sex.
Well, in the modern era, that's all people like to think about, so that's changed.
The Moffat era single-handedly rejects the idea of looms as being completely unnecessary. That is maybe a conversation to have, because I think one of the big thematic underpinnings of this era of the show is the idea of what it means to have kids, and what it means in particular for a queer man to have kids and a generation and to leave a legacy behind him. To Isaac's point, not to jump to the end of it, but it is interesting to contrast the power of the Doctor with the end of the Reality War, where it does feel like the power of the Doctor ends with Jodie Whittaker regenerating. And as Matt Strevens pointed out, they didn't know that the show was going to be picked up when they filmed that. They didn't film another side of that regeneration. Then Davies comes in and adds David Tennant back in. And that is one way of leaving the show. It is a way of saying, okay, well, this could be the end for the foreseeable future, and it's left open-ended and ambiguous, and you can close the book and it'd be a very satisfying book. I do, much like Isaac, admire the sexiest fucking risk aspect of what Davies does here, which is Davies is not going down without a fight. If Davies had ended the Reality War with Gatwa regenerating and his face completely covered in orange light and just cut to credits there, it would be a lot clearer that the show is going away for a very long time. It would be an immediate signal of weakness, and you would have the tabloid press immediately going, well, Doctor Who's over, they killed it, etc., etc. Having that frankly insane, very obviously last-minute swing for the fences of bringing in Billie Piper is very clearly Davies just clutching at straws for, well, you gotta renew us now. You can't leave it here, can you? And it does. It did a good job of generating press. It did a good job of generating attention. It made sure that the tabloid press story of Doctor Who wasn't, oh my god, Doctor Who's cancelled and it's over. It's, can you believe it's a woman Time Lord again? Can you believe it's Billie Piper again? What is the game here? It is very savvy, very, you could argue in some ways, cynical casting, but it is casting that to me feels like Davies is consciously fighting to keep the show on the air. He is making a choice in that last minute of, rather than choosing the quiet, graceful, going gently into that dark night ending that would allow the BBC to close the book on it and say, put it away and we'll come back in 20 years. Putting Billie Piper there feels like Davies just going, yeah, well, if you're going to cancel it, it's going to be bloody and it's going to be messy and you're going to have to clean up and reckon with this. It does feel like a big swing that is designed to, again, cynically calculatedly, coldly, perhaps not rationally, designed to make it more likely the show will be picked up. And it is a matter of preference which one of those two approaches you prefer, whether you would rather have a nice bow tied around the idea of Doctor Who as a revival era and then you can go and pick up and it's a fresh start later on, or if you don't want the show to end, if you want the show to go down fighting and struggling for its last breath. While I am perhaps torn on that, I do admire Davies being like, no, I am going to fight to my last breath for the show. I am going to make it as hard as possible for the show to be cancelled at this point. I kind of admire that, I have to be honest.
You can only really pull that off with someone like Billie Piper as well. You wouldn't rope in an actor who would want to play the Doctor under the promise of you might never actually get to do it.
That's the thing. As much as people criticise the David Tennant and the Rose casting, the reason why Gatwa left, allegedly, but I think very obviously, is that Gatwa's star is on the rise in Hollywood. People want to work with him, and he can't be sitting around waiting for a possible renewal of Doctor Who that is contingent on so many factors. He can't just let his career run dead. He has things that he wants to do and things that he needs to do, and he's a young actor on the up and up. He can't be kept dangling on a rope, whereas Billie Piper is hanging around the British television scene anyway. She clearly loves Doctor Who. She is still friends with Davies. He can call her up and say, look, would you like to come in and shoot the cameo? If it leads to something in a couple of months, that'd be great. If it leads to something in a couple of years, you'll probably still find time in your schedule to make it work. If it doesn't lead to anything at all, that's fine too. You cannot go to somebody like, I don't know, Chris Marshall or whoever. You cannot go to somebody like, I don't know, who would be on that list of potential actors and say, you know what? This A might get picked up in a couple of months. B might get picked up in a couple of years. C might never get picked up at all. But would you like to chain yourself to this franchise on the promise that you might at some point get to do it, depending on your schedule, our schedule, and the amount of money? The thing with Tennant and the thing with Piper is that they will ride or die for the show. And I know that Davies' story of bringing Tennant and Tate back is we got chatting and we felt like it was a good idea. It does also feel like the subtext of that was, it was a good idea and I know that I can count on David to show up whenever I absolutely need him. It's the same logic that led to the casting of Tennant as the 10th Doctor following the 9th Doctor, following Eccleston's regeneration, which is we took a big swing on Eccleston. It didn't work out. I'm very sympathetic to Eccleston's reasons for departing the show. I'm very sympathetic to Eccleston's arguments about the state of Doctor Who, etc. But from Davies' point of view, it's we took a big swing on a respected, credible, established actor, and that turned around and blew up in our face. We need to hire the guy who's going to turn up to film Doctor Who whenever I need him to, for however long I need him to, without ever getting any notion that he might kill the show. Somebody who actually cares about the show in that way. And it is Piper or it's Tennant. As cynical as it is to bring those characters back or to bring those actors back, it makes sense in the context of the production constraints making the show at this moment in time.
It's kind of like the joke of Danny DeVito's top hat's always by the phone in case Tim Burton needs it. David Tennant's big coat is always on the peg. Should the phone ring, it's like, it's in a bit of an emergency.
Yeah, it's like Christopher Nolan and Cillian Murphy. He will show up no matter where and when.
I'm more worried about it becoming a bit of a
crutch.
A crutch, yeah.
A standard stunt.
Yeah.
We had David Tennant as the 14th Doctor.
Every 10 years, David Tennant comes back to do a stint, yeah.
Somehow David Tennant returned.
This might not even be every 10.
David Tennant is the 10th, the 14th, the 18th, the 22nd Doctor.
And the 23rd somehow. David Tennant Doctors will continue until morale improves.
He bigenerates into himself, so there's just two of them at that point.
Every modern Doctor, except for Peter Capaldi, either regenerated from or into him. Yeah. And there's been about 7 of them.
I do love that when Whittaker shows up, Gatwa's like, at least it's not the other guy.
That was lovely. It's not him, he's always here.
You can't really make that joke when you're the one doing it, though.
Exactly. It's the problem of jumping to the end there. It's a big stunt casting because it's like, come on then, if you're going to cancel, we're going to cause a bit of noise. But then I also know quite a lot of people in reverse going like, oh, this feels desperate, or this is the insipid Star Wars thing of going, remember this? Here's a thing you know. So it's all big risks. And again, they do have to take big cliffhanger swings because it's soap opera. That's how TV builds on. You have to have the shock reveal that Dot Cotton's kicking about or whatever. So with Billie Piper as the next Doctor onwards.
Introducing Billie Piper, notably not credited as the Doctor.
It's introducing Billie Piper, yeah.
Because we can walk this back if it doesn't work.
That's exactly it.
I'd much prefer them just to go, okay, she's a Doctor and we're going to keep her the Doctor for a bit. Why not? As opposed to this risk of it feeling like this is potentially a Christmas special if we get it. And then there's always rumours around, will David Tennant show up? Will he do this again? Will it be every odd or even numbered Doctor is David Tennant, Billie Piper, Catherine Tate?
But I mean, the flip side of that, though, is that the industry is not stable. This is the thing where people get angry and say the show is dead or the show is in decline or whatever, but the industry is in absolute chaos. The reason why Disney didn't pick up like third season renewal on this is because outside of, is it High School Musical? Disney have not gone beyond 3 seasons on any of their dramas, including their co-productions. I think High School Musical is the only one that ran, and it ran 4 seasons, for example. They've announced that they're cutting back. The couple of weekends after the Reality War airs, you have Tony Gilroy saying, when I was making Andor, Disney were telling me that streaming is dead. Before we went on mic, Craig was talking to me about the state of the Star Trek franchise. It's been announced that Strange New Worlds is getting a final truncated season of 6 episodes. You have seasons like Mythic Quest, which gets a edited final episode when they retroactively decide to cancel it because streaming is contracting. Star Wars is going back to theaters. We talked about the 3-season limit on Disney Plus. The Mandalorian runs 3 seasons, and it goes to The Mandalorian and Grogu releasing in cinemas next May, hypothetically, Darren says. You have this thing that's happening with Marvel, where allowing for White Vision or Vision Quest or whatever it is, the 2 Marvel TV shows that are on the slate at the moment were produced mostly before the strikes back in late 2023 because they don't have the money to keep making content, but they need to keep releasing content, so they're just keeping it on the shelf for longer and longer in the hope that the cost will be absorbed by earlier quarterly reports and the benefits will be shown in current quarterly reports. Streaming and television in general are really screwed at the moment. The British television industry. You don't need me to tell you how bad things are in British television. People who work in the industry have talked about how bad it is. You've had this massive collapse of funding, particularly with international co-productions. You have the BBC unable to renew shows that are not Doctor Who, to be clear, but unable to renew shows in general because they do not have the cash flow to produce them. It is an absolutely insane time in terms of television. And to Isaac's point, as cynical as I am about all of that nostalgia stuff, and as much as I am wary of Doctor Who disappearing up the black hole of its own nostalgia, I do also understand that the lights are going out across Europe. The lights are going out across television as a medium, and there is all sorts of devil's bargains that need to be made, where I am not happy that Davies had to go to Disney Plus to get the money to make these 2 seasons. I honestly believe that Doctor Who is a British television show that is a British public good. And I'm also, as somebody who is watching streaming and aware of the streaming bubble, I kind of predicted that what was going to happen would happen because it happened with every streaming television show. The Leopards ate people's faces from the Leopards eating people's faces party. Streaming ended the way that it was always going to end, the way that it was predicted as it was going to end, and nobody's come out of the streaming revolution happy or satisfied. As we're recording this, Universal is spinning off its own spinco to absorb debt. You have David Zaslav splitting up Warner Brothers and Discovery, making Discovery liable for Warner's debt in order to sell it on. You have Paramount trying to sell itself to Skydance. The entire industry is in chaos and is completely unstable, and everybody is fighting for space on the door in Titanic. The ship is going down, and there's the question, can Kate Winslet and can Leo hold onto the door? And I am perhaps more forgiving now than I would have been 5 or 10 years ago of the devil's bargains that need to be made in order to keep these things afloat and to keep them going. I am more understanding that these decisions that Davies make are not in a vacuum of storytelling, but are in fact in a reality of I need to produce this. I don't know that we live in a world where you can hire somebody to play the Doctor for 3 seasons because you can't guarantee that you're going to get 3 seasons of the show. I don't know that you can hire a new up-and-coming actor and have a plan. It is very obvious that Davies himself was screwed on this. It's very obvious watching these 2 seasons that Davies had a plan for a 3rd season, that the Susan stuff was meant to pay off in a hypothetical 3rd season of the show on Disney+. That was going somewhere. Susan just appears in the Interstellar Song Contest and in Wish World, and it doesn't go anywhere because it's very clear that Davies was setting that up for a hypothetical 3rd season because he was making long-term plans. But the reality of modern television production is you cannot make long-term plans, and that is a problem when it comes to a show like Doctor Who, because if you cannot make long-term plans, you cannot even hire lead actors. You cannot hire somebody to play the Doctor if you cannot make anything resembling a long-term plan for Doctor Who. So I am more sympathetic to Davies now than I would have been like 5 or 10 years ago.
One of the interesting things with the whole streaming setup as it is, we often laugh about and get frustrated at the fact that you watch a season of television and 3 years later you'll see another season of it, maybe. But then that sort of model does actually allow for actors like maybe Ncuti Gatwa to hang around in something like Doctor Who for a bit longer. So it's the idea of, I have to come and make this thing every 3 years. So then I have 3 years in order to go do something else. That's been happening with a lot of streaming shows where there's been such long gaps that you see these actors actors cropping up all over the place because there's time.
The Stranger Things actors are mostly married and have kids now, which is insane to me. To your point about Gatwa, and we should be clear, these are all rumors. We don't know if they're true, but they do come from sources that did a great deal of leaking of what actually turned out to be true over the course of the season in terms of narrative elements, so maybe we should give them the benefit of the doubt. But the argument is that the decision to have Gatwa regenerate at the end of the season, that was part of reshoots that happened in 2024, so after the second season had been shot. But isn't the rumor that the decision to actually have it happen to edit it into the episode was made halfway through the broadcast of the second season? So Gatwa did wait, to your point. What, he was announced in 2022, 2021 even? So he did wait like 4 years to see if he was getting a third season. In terms of production, he waited like 2.5 years, given that the way the season shot was in early 2024 or whatever. They did wait as long as they could, it seems, before they made the decision that Gatwa had to go. But even then, it's down to the wire. And we are living in a world where, as we're recording this today, it's announced that CBeebies is doing an animated Doctor Who TV show. We still have the Battle Between Land and Sea, which is supposed to premiere this year, but will probably end up being pushed out to next year. The Doctor Who spin-off under Disney+. It's a weird liminal space where Doctor Who is technically still alive, but is also not vibrant in the way that a stable television show should be. It would be one thing if it were dead and, to Isaac's point, we were in the wilderness years again. But we're not. And worst case scenario is we're not going to be in the wilderness years until 2027, 2028. That is the absolute worst case scenario. But it's also, we are not in a state where Doctor Who is being produced for those 3 years either. It is such a strange liminal space in terms of television production where I'm like, I am kind of sympathetic to Davies because it's not his fault that the British television industry is collapsing at the same time that streaming is imploding, at the same time that Disney are pulling back and pushing into theaters. Davies makes bad choices. I have my issues with the reality war. I think I described the opening 40 minutes of the reality war as unforgivable, and I stand by that. But I also don't think the show's status as something that exists on the bubble is Davies' fault, so much as it is a result of gestures to everything.
Yeah, he's just the guy who has it currently.
But there's a perception thing to play in there. Isaac, you talked about how you said that people said, that was a roundabout way of getting to the end of that sentence. But anyway, you said that people pointed out that they thought it was a bit desperate, the Billy Piper reveal. And that was how I felt when I watched it at the time. Also, I remembered in the back of my mind reading a rumour weeks ago that Billy Piper might be the next Doctor. I don't know where I read that or how I read it, but it was in the back of my mind. When the regeneration was happening, I was thinking, is this going to be Billy Piper? And then it was, but I didn't predict that. I remembered reading it anyway. But the thing about it being a bit desperate, and this is what every bloody franchise is doing at the moment, they're eating themselves. We've talked about it on innumerable podcasts in the past, the idea that all these things are so caught up in their own iconography that they can't get past themselves. So you get this point where Strange New Worlds, as much as I like it, is trying to be Star Trek and not quite managing to be Star Trek.
Every episode of Strange New Worlds you can point to and say that is an episode of a pre-existing Star Trek show. You can literally say, well, that is First Flight from the Enterprise, that is Fighter Flight from Enterprise, that is Impulse from Enterprise, that is Regeneration from Enterprise. I love that I'm not even naming the episodes of Strange New Worlds, but you can point to every episode of Strange New World and say, well, that is just 3 episodes of Star Trek in a blender. It's 3 kids in a trench coat pretending to be a Star Trek episode, you know?
And Star Wars is largely characters sitting around talking about Star Wars, and then they claim that it's a TV show. But look at any franchise. Marvel's doing it now. Major blockbusters are calling back to themselves. We have another Jurassic World movie coming out soon where it's the 7th time they're in the jungle being chased by dinosaurs because things can't seem to innovate. And I thought Doctor Who was actually largely exempt from that. The finale's accepted. These 2 seasons have been very of themselves. There hasn't been a lot of major callbacks, certainly not a lot of them that were derailing the stories being told. And then you have this finale that ends with, oh, look, Billy Piper's back. And you bookend this new era with David Tennant being back and now Billy Piper's back. And it just seems like this show isn't moving on. I think about Moffat talking on that documentary thing, 20 Years of New Who, that they released the week after the reality war that I watched. And he talked about Doctor Who being this transient job that you should do for a while and then move on.
And age out of, yeah.
Rich coming from him, who came back to write 2 scripts for this new run, but...
Well, I mean, there's a difference between... I've said this before. My attitude is that you should not have a second era running Doctor Who, just on principle.
Or anything.
Yeah, it should be continuous and evolving, but I do also understand that the sense is that if it wasn't Davies, it was Oblivion. That's the thing. It's not a choice between Davies and the writer of Line of Duty. It's not a choice between Davies and Neil Cross, as much as Darren might want that to be the case. It is unfortunately a choice between Davies and a blank screen.
Yeah, but Doctor Who has never certainly in the current era, or since 2005, has never been beholden to its previous self. You get a new Doctor and then you just get a new Doctor, don't you? It's not really looping back on itself too much. You can make arguments about times that it does that, but broadly speaking, things are moving on, and then it does feel like it's doing the current franchise model of imitating itself. That's what I found frustrating about the Billy Piper thing.
I suppose the question is, what do you prefer? At the moment, we have no idea what's happening. What feels better for you? That the show continues as and when it fights on as a TV show, or would you prefer it stop and not get pulled into the struggle of the TV world? I think I'm leaning towards B, but I also know Craig doesn't. I don't know if you, Darren, listen to any Big Finish. I'm a big fan. There's always books being written and there's comics. I think I'd rather the show go into this wilderness era, another thing where it's not part of the current TV landscape, as opposed to we'll see what we can get in this very fragmented thing. I mean, it has been on for 20 years, only just shy of the original run.
Uninterrupted for 20 years, yeah.
Well, with the occasional gap year, to be fair, but yeah.
With the occasional gap year, but as I said, in terms of TV, no one knows really what TV's like. They're sort of spinning the wheels until it settles down. Is it best to sit back?
5 years off might not be the worst thing in the world for it, actually. And especially if we're just waiting for the dust to settle on this current mess of streaming versus TV versus movies versus whatever. It might not be the worst thing in the world to just wait and see what the future looks like and then have a go. Give people a chance to miss it.
My flip side is we are very lucky in that it went away and came back. And obviously we are biased as fans of these sorts of properties where Star Trek went away and came back. Battlestar Galactica arguably went away and came back or whatever. But some things go away and don't come back, or some things go away and come back in weird ways that we don't like. And my general attitude to Isaac's point is that while I understand and respect that, if I believed that, if I subscribed to option B, I would not have gotten Gatwa as the Doctor. I would not have gotten Boom 73 Yards and Dot and Bubble. I would not have gotten Lux or The Well. We would have lost something if we had not done the David Tennant stuff. We would have not got Boom. We would not have got 73 Yards, which I think is hugely experimental. We would not have got Dot and Bubble, which for my mind proves the show is as vital as it's ever been. I do tend to be of a take the rough with the smooth of it, and this is me being the guy who's like, the finales are not great because they're Davies finales, but seasons are more than just the 2 episodes at the end of them. I like that we got Gatwa. There's going to be some argument that Gatwa is a quote-unquote incomplete Doctor because he didn't face the Cybermen, the Dalek, or the Master, or he only got 2 seasons, or he left early, or the status of that regeneration, which was hastily cut together. But I do like that we got him, and I feel like he is a valuable addition to the mythos. And if the 14th Doctor was necessary to make that happen, and I say that as somebody who thinks Wild Blue Yonder is a fantastic episode of television and has a great deal of fondness for the giggle, as controversial as that might be, I'm willing to take the rough with the smooth. And with the Billy Piper stuff, I agree with Craig. I think it is cynical, I think it is stunt casting, it is, are we doing this again? But if that allows the show to maneuver itself into a position where we get something equivalent to The Devil's Cord, or Boom, or Lux, or The Well, or 73 Yards, or Dot and Bubble, I can accept that. Maybe I'm cynical.
I'm also very aware that me choosing option B is coming from a sort of privilege where I have a lot of foreknowledge already. 1, it's buying things. It's not a free service. It's not on the telly. 2, as I said, Big Finish, but Big Finish is currently tied into the classic era with dips of David Tennant when available.
Is Tennant and Piper and Eccleston not part of it, no?
They are part of it.
Isn't Alex Kingston as well? And Joe Martin surely has done some, right?
Joe Martin's done some. Jodie Whittaker is doing some. So they do have the new series as well.
Oh, fantastic.
That's the fastest pre-order I ever made. But again, it's a pre-order I had to make. I had to drop money because it costs. But then thinking back to when I was 8 or 9 and Doctor Who wasn't on, and it was videos I got for birthdays or Christmas. It was scraps. Whereas now I can go back to the Big Finish website, I can find old books and read on, and if Doctor Who did stop, I can continue. But that's because it's work that I'm happy to put in the same way that if Marvel stopped making films, the comics exist, but it's impossible to get in because you have to do the work. So I can only sort of speak going like, yes, I would probably prefer option B, but that's because it works for myself. In terms of the show, option A is probably the best because it keeps it in the public consciousness, the same way that Sherlock, being this other BBC example, that every 2 years it made 3 episodes. We don't get much.
Bang for your buck, yeah.
Yeah, over 8 or so years, you got 8 episodes. It's stretched out, but it's still there. So I can only say I'm happy with that one, but because I know that I would do the research and go on eBay to find the old books and keep on with that stuff. But it's probably not for the popularity of the show and the brand. And of course, things like this are built on. I loved it because I was a kid and I watched on and I like writing and stuff. Russell Davis, Mark Gatiss, all the writers watched it as a kid, like writing and stuff and did it. If it descends to, oh, it's just for the 30 and 40-year-olds who have a job. That's how it dies, because no one's watching it. And then it doesn't come back because it's Blake 7. It's all media. It's gone. It's not for anyone. And that's obviously a very dangerous way, as opposed to keeping it in a scatter way, even if it is occasional Christmas specials with whoever as the Doctor, is probably the best for the longevity. But personal preference, it's different seeing what works for me and what works for the show, I suppose.
That was part of our conversation about Andor, Darren, in one of the seasons, or possibly both, on the idea that these franchises need to invite in new viewers, new consumers, otherwise they'll die. If Doctor Who is just going to be for the 30, 40-year-old fans, then it will eventually just eat itself. It can't sustain itself on that.
It is worth noting that the attempts to revive Doctor Who, we got so very lucky with Davies coming back, and Davies being somebody who obviously loves Doctor Who to death, who to Isaac's point had written for the Expanded Universe novels and stuff like that. But there were so many different competing visions of what Doctor Who would look like when it came back. Scream of the Shelka, or that web series starring Stephen Fry and stuff like that. It does feel like the show won the lottery in coming back, and I'm like, do we want to spin the wheel again? Do we think if we spin the wheel again, we'll get the exact right confluence of good outcomes?
We do live in a period where nothing that was once popular will be allowed to lie fallow for too long, though. It will be 5 years, let's try Doctor Who again, because we haven't picked up that in a while. And I think part of my acceptance of the potential 5-year or whatever it is, hiatus, is perhaps down to the fact that I just can't find myself being all that excited about stuff that I should be excited about. I got to watch a Star Trek episode and I'm thinking, I feel like I'm just doing this out of some kind of obligation. And it's not that I don't enjoy the Star Trek episodes, but I think in a lot of the things I used to enjoy, there's a lot of bad faith being built up. There was Picard Season 3, for example, or Picard Season 2 and 1 even. Those kinds of things are just not what I want to watch, and I always feel that bit of trepidation going into these things. So it's almost like, give me a little bit of a gap to get excited about these things again.
But the counterpoint is that without the gap, you still get Andor. Look, I'm willing to put my hands up and say one of the reasons I do like this second season of the show as much as I do is because I think this is better than most of the streaming Star Wars shows. I think this is better than most of the streaming Star Trek shows.
Yeah,
I think this is still at a level where it is interesting. It's that thing where you watch Andor and you're like, why can't all Star Wars be this good? Sorry to dump on the other Star Wars shows, the other Star Wars media, but where you watch it and you're like, actually, what's happened here is not that I'm tired of this. It's not that I'm worn out. It's not that I'm incapable of getting excited about this thing. It's not like I'm getting worn down by attrition or by mass or by volume. It's just that most of it isn't very good. And I still think, and this is maybe a controversial opinion, particularly in light of the reaction to the finale. The reaction to the finale was thermonuclear, and I'm willing to accept the finale is not great. But I still got, when I was watching The Robot Revolution, Lux, The Well, the story, and the engine, I was like, this is good television. I'm having a good time. I like these characters. I like these stories. I think they're still engaged with things. I think they still have things to say about the world in which we exist, which is, to your point, not how I feel when I watch something like, Strange New Worlds, to pick a specific example.
Do you find yourself surprised, though, when you come out of an episode of Doctor Who or something thinking, wow, that was pretty good?
I will say I found myself surprised coming out of The Robot Revolution. That's the thing, because it had been so long. When I go into the show or when the show starts, I'm like, this is pretty good. It takes me a while to get back into trusting the show again. But it's just trusting media again. Watching Andor, I didn't relax till after I'd watched the 4th episode, because I was like, sure, these things normally start good. WandaVision starts very good. Falcon and the Winter Soldier starts very good. But can you maintain that level of quality? And because of the way these things work, you sink 8 hours into the thing. So it's really frustrating when you get to the end of a serialized narrative and it just implodes. Whereas with Doctor Who, and again, maybe this is my privilege, or maybe I'm out of touch, maybe I'm old, Craig, maybe I don't reflect the kids or whatever, but theoretically, every time I watch Doctor Who, I could be watching the best episode of Doctor Who ever made. There is a remote possibility that what I stick on my TV at 7 p.m. on a Saturday night and stick on Boom or whatever, that could turn out to be a new entry in my top 10 episodes of Doctor Who ever made. And that is not the case with most of these franchises.
It's such a good feeling as well. When you watch it, like, oh, that was a good one.
I love coming out of something and thinking, that was good, I enjoyed that. That felt like a good use of my time.
Yeah, it's not an obligation. And I don't think Doctor Who is at the level where it feels like an obligation to me, is the thing. And I say that as somebody whose job it is to consume media. We were talking off mic about media that we had to consume recently as reviewers that were like, this does feel like an obligation to us. Whereas Doctor Who never did and never has, which is maybe a statement of how healthy it is. Even after the reality war, where I don't like the first 40 minutes of that episode, I come out of that and I'm like, well, that was a bum 40 minutes, but Lux is like nothing I have ever seen. The show is still doing things that surprise me at the age of, 60, 62 years old.
Yeah, and then the thing about the reality war is it reminded me of the End of Time Part 2 in a way that the first half of it, say, was to me pretty disposable nonsense, and then it almost rescues itself in the second half that you can almost ignore what came before. And then the thing is, the narrative inconsistencies and stuff, the end of Belinda's arc, such as it was, sort of tacked on, didn't really occur to me until the term fridge logic, till I went to get a drink out the fridge and I was like, hang on a minute, and then it started to unravel. But in the moment, those things largely worked for me, and I think that's again the power of television. At that point, you're sitting there watching it being like, no notes, I'm not thinking about the ins and outs of it as yet, and then you dissect it later. But when you're watching it, you're like, yeah, I'm glad I came to the cinema to watch this. Actually.
Yeah, as much as my issues I have with the reality war, like, I'm glad I watched it in the cinema with fans. And for all the online complaining about it, fans came out talking about it. Can you believe that? Did you see that? And not in a negative way of, oh my God, they've jumped the shark. It's like, whoa, what's going on here? Because to a lot of people, Billie Piper is beloved.
Do you remember after Empire of Death at the cinema, Isaac? People at 1 a.m, just like, oh, that was awful.
Oh, that was sad. It was just silent. Same thing happened in series 1 where everyone loved that series, and then the finale happened and everyone suddenly lit the flaming torches and went to his doorstep. But I do remember the incredibly quiet cinema all standing up and shuffling and getting their coats on and be like, oh, I did not.
When's the bus?
Gotta catch a 1 a.m. bus, yeah.
It's not generated any buzz or anything.
Someone suggested to me that Doctor Who might benefit from a more Sherlock-like structure for a while. You have 3 hour, 20-minute episodes or whatever.
Like the 60th specials, basically, yeah.
Yeah. Just do that for a while. But then that's contingent on all 3 of them being good. And the thing with Sherlock is you would maybe get one of them that was pretty great per year, and the other 2 are like, yeah, okay. The less you have, the more each of them has to be amazing.
Weight there is on it, yeah.
Yeah. When it was 13 before, you can put up with 1 or 2 duff episodes, maybe.
I suppose one thing to add is, like I said, if it wasn't on TV, we don't get looks or the well and stuff. But then in the world of great storytelling, all this stuff happens around. One of the wonderful things about Doctor Who, and I think one of the reasons I really enjoy Big Finish specifically, is they have the full, I suppose best to call it, toy box. Because they have essentially every Doctor and they have the whole timeline, and the show is a tiny show. There was a really brilliant 5th Doctor story release called Hooklight in 2 parts over the course of April and May. Big spoilers for Hooklight, if anyone is listening to that, who is listening to Big Finish. The first part is an adventure's happening, an evil Time Lord is kicking around. We all know who it is. There's a devilish manipulator working behind the scenes. And in the end of the final part of that one, it's Paul McGann. And the story is that the 5th Doctor messes this up so badly, another one has to step in and fix it. And when you have the whole world to play with, you can do very, very silly things. And I thought it was like a brilliant idea of having the rug pull of the master, and then actually, no, in this case, we're doing it as a story from the 80s, but with the foresight of knowing what comes afterwards, but treating it as contemporary and then having a lot of fun there.
It's a little bit what Davies did in his first run, the whole idea of the Doctor just leaves Satellite 5 and assumes that everything will be fine.
Yeah.
And then he returns and it's the game station. He's like, oh, probably should have spent a bit more time fixing this.
Obviously, we live in linear time. That's what happens. So we don't know who the 19th, 20th or 21st Doctors are going to be. I suppose the same with all Star Trek, Star Wars and stuff. I'm sure there's been Star Trek stories where Picard has met Shatner and stuff, because you have the whole toy box, you have all the elements, and you can play them in any which way order. And I think definitely with a show like Doctor Who, which is a time travel show, I think Sylvester McCoy's Doctor's meeting Missy at the moment. I don't know what the story is, but you can go for it, just have fun. It's so silly.
I don't want to denigrate that, because that's what fans like and fans enjoy that, and that's very particularly laser guided at the fans, but that is very different to me from something like Lux, which is we are going to actually animate a character. Lux is something that is designed for mass audiences and designed to be broadcast on BBC on Saturday evening. Whereas the 5th Doctor and the 8th Doctor manipulating each other is great for fans, for people like ourselves who care about this, but it's less accessible than something like Boom, which is the Doctor just stands on a landmine for 45. Can the Doctor solve a story without moving is a very simple narrative premise that is executed remarkably well, as opposed to the more, as you say, time travel-y, continuity, referencey stuff, which I don't have a problem with, but feels more specifically tailored to hardcore fans, to people who already know and love Doctor Who, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very much when you're fully in, that's for you. But I'll just bring out with this sort of show, there's different things you can do with it. People complain that there hasn't been any Daleks or Cybermen for a while. Well, there's loads of them. It's not necessarily that this is exactly just it. If you didn't like Omega's appearance in this one, the other ones are fine. Big Fish has done Omega, probably. Surely that's been a thing. There's so much different ways of doing stories and different formats and mediums that you can do stories in. There's bits for everyone, essentially.
If people are complaining about no Daleks now, then they should have been around 15 years ago when we were complaining about too much of Daleks.
Even during the Chibnall era, where the Daleks arrived like clockwork every Christmas. And again, not an issue. This is the thing about peaks and valleys. You can have an extended era of the show that doesn't feature the Daleks, and you can have an extended era of the show that features the Daleks too much. And it is possible to, in the grand scheme of things, find a version of the show that works for you. Like, again, for all that we talk about how there should not be a Russell T Davies 2.0, to that point Moffat made, that the show needs to be continuously evolving and doing new things. I do like that Davies, as much as we criticize him for having some of the same thematic interests and having the same issues that he has writing finales, Davies is trying new things with the show. He is not falling back on the, oh my god, it's the Daleks reveal at the season cliffhanger, like he did on the first, second, and fourth season finales of his 4 season finales. He's like, okay, I'm taking that toy out of the chest. Now, we can argue that, oh my god, it's this character from a forgotten 70s story, isn't that much of an improvement, but it is a creator trying new things. And I do think the show is still trying new things at its age. That's the thing. I don't know that there has ever been an episode of Doctor Who like 73 Yards. I don't know that there's ever been an episode of Doctor Who like Dot and Bubble. Even something like Lucky Day, which is obviously indebted to stuff like Love and Monsters, for example, but is a completely different beast. The show is still trying new things. Whether or not they work, obviously, mileage varies, doctors differ, but I do think there is still some vitality there, some hunger there, and I think Davies is trying new things. The thing that I love about Davies 2.0 is that it is clear that, we've talked about this already, but that Davies watched the Moffat era and the Chibnall era, and he has ideas. It is very obvious that the final conversation between Belinda and the Doctor at the end of the Robot Revolution is very heavily inspired by Clara's conversation with the Doctor at the end of Kill the Moon. You can't treat me like this. I'm not an idiot. Don't condescend to me. Don't talk down to me. I know what you're doing. Don't try and act smart. Even things like the metafictional aspect of the show, which is very heavily influenced by Moffat. The fairy tale theme of the show that is very heavily influenced by gods and myths and legends and goblins, which is very much indebted to the direction that Moffat took the show after he took over from Davies, which was much more fairy-taled, where it's like Amelia Pond. I do think that Davies is trying new things, and again, he is still fundamentally Davies. He is still going to do the big stupid finale that doesn't really work for 40 minutes, but maybe sticks the emotional landing depending on your tolerance for it. I do think that the show is still capable of surprising me. I don't know that I've ever seen an episode of Doctor Who like The Story and the Engine, for example. For all my issues with the Interstellar Song Contest, I don't think I've ever seen an episode of Doctor Who like the Interstellar Song Contest before. Maybe this is just, I am so disillusioned from my time in the IP mines that I'm like, this feels like manna from heaven, this feels like a breath of fresh air, but it does feel like the show still has things to give, and maybe I'm just naive, maybe I've got poor taste or whatever, but it does feel still hungry and exciting and fresh to me.
I do agree. I do think that none of the other major franchises that we've discussed are really doing anything too outside the box in terms of the stories that they're telling. And for example, I do think that there's infinite potential in Strange New Worlds to go off format, although I don't know what the format of Strange New Worlds actually is, but it could go more off format in an obvious way and tell different types of stories. Star Wars could do that. Again, Andor accepted. I think Andor took some big swings in terms of its storytelling, such as having an episode that didn't feature Andor for even a second.
This is the thing about, you mentioned Star Wars and Star Trek. You're right to say that the ending reveal of Billie Piper here does feel like everything the modern franchise storytelling does. It does feel very franchise inclined. But I think more broadly, my issue with modern franchises is it's that nostalgia, but it's also coupled with a complete unwillingness to say anything about the modern world. Strange New Worlds is emulating the format and the structure of Berman-era Star Trek from the 1990s, but Berman-era Star Trek from the 1990s was using that to tell stories about contemporary culture. It was using that to tell stories about sometimes gang culture in Los Angeles, for example, NAFTA and free trade and all this sort of, all these things that were very current and very contemporary and reflected the world in which we live. And same thing with Star Wars, where Star Wars in the 70s was about Watergate and about Vietnam and Richard Nixon and all these things that were percolating through the culture and spoke to that moment in time and captured it in amber and put it up there. And where even the prequels, for all their flaws, were about George W. Bush, 9/11, the War on Terror, all this sort of stuff. My issue with so much modern franchise stuff is that it's stuck recycling the iconography without anything underpinning it. Has Strange New Worlds said anything about the world in which we live today? Has Strange New Worlds ever produced an episode that to me says this is a perfect snapshot of this moment in time in which we're living? And I don't think it has.
And without breaking embargo, there's an episode coming up that actively avoids doing that, even though it's well set up to do so.
Yeah, again, same thing with a lot of the Mandalorian stuff. What makes Andor Andor feels so fresh is that it is doing that. Obviously, Gilroy says he is drawing from history and he's drawing from culture and he's drawing from context, but it's hard not to watch a moment where truth died on the Gorman Plaza. The death of truth is the last rubric on the road to fascism, and not look at the world right now in this post-truth alternative facts era and go, this is a show about now. This is a show about this moment exactly now. And to Davies' credit, I watch these 2 seasons of Doctor Who, and they do feel like they are in conversation with the now. They do feel like they are in conversation with the world as it exists today. You can say Planet of the Incels is an incredibly clumsy line, but it is very pointed that Davies comes back to this idea of controlling abusive toxic masculinity repeatedly. Conrad, as introduced in Lucky Day, is an incredibly contemporary, resonant character there. Even things like the way in which the show handles Gatwa or the 15th Doctor talking about what it means to be in a body that is not white, and the representation of that, or the character's willingness to flaunt gender norms, where he is wearing, yes, it is a kilt because he is Scottish and Rwandan, but it's very consciously a dress as well because he is blurring the boundaries between genders. This show is saying things about the world in which we live, saying things about the world as it exists now, this moment. And it is angry and it is hungry, and that for me is the difference between the nostalgic invocation of Billy Piper and what if Yoda but he's a baby, but also what if Boba Fett but he's got a shiny costume. I still think that Davies is using Doctor Who to engage with the now, in the same way that he did back in the early 2000s, where he repeatedly had Tony Blair killed on screen, where it was very clear that he had very strong opinions about George W. Bush over the course of those seasons, for example. Watching these episodes, it does feel more in the present than a lot of this media does, or a lot of modern franchise show does. Is that fair of me to say?
No, I think it's perfectly fair. As much as Lucky Day is a mess, I do think it dials into a very visceral type of person that we've all met and that we all try to avoid talking to. It's just this idea of some people really suck and they won't believe the evidence that's in front of their face, even though it's irrefutable. Ruby's line in that episode, yeah, we all know aliens exist, and it's always been that weird thing that Doctor Who is, certainly since the Davies era, has confirmed but never really reckoned with in any way. You have the Big Ben incident and then everybody just goes back to normal after. You have the Sycorax invade on Christmas Day, everyone gets back to normal after.
You have the cracks in time, yeah.
Yeah, and then you have in Torchwood, this was all just mass hysteria caused by television or something. It's not really happening. But again, it's Doctor Who still has to take place in our world, so we can't really live in a world where casually everybody knows about aliens. You need to have normal people caught in the crossfire of what the hell is going on here. Otherwise, the show can't become a show that's set in our world. I know Marvel Comics struggle with that.
The world outside your window. Why hasn't Mr. Fantastic cured cancer?
Yeah, or how can you have people just going about their day in New York City when Avengers Tower is right there and they have weekly alien invasions, that kind of stuff.
Joy to the World mentions COVID. Joy to the World is the rare modern TV show that actually acknowledges and deals with COVID.
Yeah, and like I said, you had those Doctor Who episodes that were released during COVID, that were set during COVID, but they don't mention it. Yeah. So you just assume that Doctor Who was at that point set in this alternate reality where COVID wasn't happening.
1 degree off.
But the police had Daleks instead.
Which world is better, Craig?
Well, I don't know. Arguably, we live in both.
That's fair.
So the thing is, I was really engaged with Lucky Day for about 2/3 of it. And then it does that thing. What's that writer anyway? Is it Pete McTeague?
Pete McTeague, yeah.
Kerblam.
Yeah. He comes up with a reasonable idea that seems relevant, but it ends up just being a bunch of buzzwords thrown together by the end of it, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But I was really into it for the first 2/3.
It's a great twist. The twist that Conrad is the worst person in the world. And to your point, Conrad is a really great character because he is the worst person in the world. I actually do think one of the more interesting aspects of Wishworld and the Reality War is that Davies gives Conrad the time of day. It would be very easy to present Conrad as this deeply cynical guy who does not believe anything and is nihilistic and is just exploiting the idiocy of his followers. But in Wishworld and the Reality War, Conrad is trying to make the world a better place. He just lacks the awareness and ability to perceive things beyond himself to actually make the world a better place, which I find really interesting. It's a really clever twist on that archetype, which I found surprisingly humanist.
When you have Rose appear as soon as the reality seeps into Unit HQ because he just can't comprehend the concept of a trans person.
And again, it's something that Davies has talked about, where Davies has said, this is the thing for me. I was unaware of this stuff when I was writing the first time. I needed to be educated. And there is a sense in which, as much as Conrad is this suffocating heteronormative man, he is a white man trying to conceive of all of reality. He is like a showrunner on Doctor Who. He is Davies saying, I didn't have trans characters the first time around. I didn't have minority characters. I didn't write gay characters. Well, I did write some gay characters, but not as many as I would have liked. I didn't have a diverse array of perspectives because as much as I'm a queer man, I was still a white cis man. I have blinders on me just by default. And I love that Conrad of all characters kind of ends up representing that. Imagine Conrad being your self-insert character. For all the people say that Davies has this huge, incredible ego, and the way that he talks about the show maybe feeds into that idea, I do think it is very interesting that Conrad is the way that Davies has talked about writing Doctor Who, of being like, I wasn't malicious, I just wasn't aware. I didn't know about this stuff, and I've tried to educate myself, make myself better.
A bit like Xander and Buffy being Joss Whedon, except he wasn't aware that he was actually Xander in really negative ways as well. That was a strange one. You see it reflected in the general casting in this series as well, where you have a variety of body types just turning up in different roles. So they're not making a point out of the people that are playing certain characters. They are in some cases. You have, what's her name, Ruth?
Oh, Ruth Madeley?
Oh, that's the actor, isn't it? I can't remember the character's name. Shirley, that's it. They're making a point out of her being in a wheelchair because it's not that big a plot point in Wish World, actually. We're going to look at a tablet and then reset and nothing comes of it. But yeah, I do have other characters. There's the one in the Interstellar Song Contest, for example, the program controller person.
Who is a person of short stature, yeah.
You could see in other shows being just cast as whatever word I'm going to use will be the wrong one. But you know what I mean, or I hope you know what I mean. So you saw that variety throughout in terms of who was being cast and in terms of Ruby's friends as well.
Alice in the Well was not deaf in the script, which is insane to me.
Oh, really?
Apparently Davies was like, I didn't write her as deaf. That just came to me in the casting. That is insane given how much The Well leans on that, how much The Well is about this idea of how turning your back on someone is literally, again, to get into that idea of Davies and that core theme of Davies being like, if you ignore these things or if you turn your back on them or if you don't acknowledge the lived reality of people who exist outside the normal confines of society, you are effectively consigning them to oblivion or death. But the idea of, Alice being somebody who, when you turn your back on her, she cannot hear what you're saying. And that being part of the metaphor of the episode, where when she turns her back on somebody, they die. It is so weird to me that Davies claims that he didn't write Alice as a deaf character, because it fits so perfectly with the theme of what that episode is about, which is when you turn your back on a marginalized person, you are effectively, in this moment in time culturally, arguably signing some sort of death warrant, or at least consigning them to the possibility of all sorts of terrible things happening in the world right now.
And then you had Conrad being like, I forgot about South Africa and it flooded, or whatever it was he said.
Yeah, when I was reading the weather, again, it would be so easy to make Conrad cynical. And I love that Ruby, at the end, has this moment of wishing for Conrad to be happy, which is just this moment of magnanimity for a character who does not deserve it, to be clear. Conrad is the worst guy in the world, but I love that Ruby is like, no, my empathy does extend not only to people like Shirley, but also to people like Conrad. It is a weirdly humanist, optimistic story for the Davies era. To get back to Lucky Day, my issue with Lucky Day, it's the problem of UNIT writ large, which is that UNIT is people who surround the Doctor with guns and kill things, and the second episode of the Pertwee era includes a genocide orchestrated by UNIT. There is this inherent tension between the Doctor, who is nominally a pacifist, even though that is in inverted commas, but working with an openly military organization, but the show over time warming to that military operation as part of the show's continuity and history. So the Doctor hates guns, but loves UNIT when they show up with their big guns. This is something that's present during the Davies 1 era as well, like the Sontaran episode, The Poison Sky.
If I see one more gun, yeah.
Yeah, but the Doctor is still like, great to see UNIT again, I love seeing UNIT, as they parade around with their big fecking guns. But I do think that the show runs into this problem of not being capable of being skeptical of UNIT, because UNIT is part of the franchise brain of this. Davies is planning a UNIT spin-off. The Land Between Moor and Sea is releasing later this year or next year, so UNIT is part of the Doctor Who mythos. So you can't have criticism of UNIT, even though in the world of the show, I'm watching Lucky Day, and while Conrad is the worst person in the world, I'm also like, maybe Geneva should have some oversight of what's going on. If you're keeping, is it the Shriek, in one of the most densely populated cities on the planet, where the only thing separating it from the outside world is a single air vent, maybe you should be held to higher standards of accountability than you are being held to. I'm not saying Conrad was right, but it does run into that problem that Kerblam does with Space Amazon, which is, look, I think we can all agree that we're all a little angry at UNIT or Space Amazon, But in the grand scheme of things, we should maybe just let them do what they're doing, and it's probably better than the alternative. It's so interesting that it's the same mistake, or the same issue.
An organisation that biochips its employees.
And hires kids. I love that she just hires kids. Is it the timeline on Conrad is that Conrad would have been like 12 when he was applying to join UNIT. And Kate looked at that 12-year-old across the table and was like, don't trust him.
I think what makes UNIT funny is I watched a few of the John Pertwee, Tom Baker era where UNIT was prevalent because he had a lot of it on Earth. I like to imagine that it hasn't really changed. Back in those stories, all the units seemed to film in the back of a school, and it was just a few guys having a cup of tea constantly. Now they have villains like the Sheik and probably some Daleks somewhere in an archive thingy. And probably back in the 70s they did as well, but in various sheds just in the countryside.
Now they have a rotating tower with guns.
Yes, they have a Gundam. I didn't mind it during the Moffat era either because they have an underground basement, basically, and it looks like they've got about 5 people working for them. But because Davies is franchise-brained and because UNIT need to be the biggest thing on Earth, they now have, as you say, Avengers Tower in the middle of London where they're housing all of these incredibly dangerous aliens with nobody keeping track of them.
He's basically turned them into what he did to Torchwood. That's essentially what they've become.
Without the skepticism of Torchwood. Doomsday is skeptical of Torchwood.
And the Torchwood show is all about how morally
questionable what Jack does is, yeah.
I remember when Marvel, the Civil War movie came out, which I don't like. The whole thing, everyone was the airport fight. This great Marvel fight about whether or not superheroes should be allowed to do this. This is the biggest advert for Sokovia Accords possible because they're just wrecking an airport. They've ground every flight over Europe because they're having a bit of a dispute.
They ruined so many people's holidays.
They ruined so many people's holidays. But then the same with Lucky Day. One of my favourite points, I remember, is in Darren, your review afterwards. Conrad fakes a monster invasion in this quaint little village, which is very classic Doctor Who-y. That's tended to be set. And UNIT respond. And he's like, oh, look, they're jumping at ghosts. But then you said in yours, if you call the fire brigade to report a fire, they're just doing their job.
Yeah, if you fake a fire and the fire brigade show up, the problem is not the fire brigade. I do love, though, that it's very self-aware. Is the rescue, isn't that the early Liam Hartnell episode where the guy in the rubber suit turns out to be a guy in a rubber suit?
Yeah, it's just a guy, yeah.
Yeah, I love that Davies brings that back, where the Shriek are just dudes in rubber suits.
I think also towards all the big climax of that episode, my watching, I know sort of how you perceive something, and then you go on Twitter and you see how everyone else does it. In that, the big finale is Kate releases the Sheik as essentially her sort of calling his bluff. And everyone was like, oh, is this Kate going too far? And I was like, well, this is probably the best case scenario because it's in your lockdown super tower.
But Abraham points out that it's just a vent keeping it from going to London.
It is just a vent. But when you have a man in the room who's already shot an agent, he's already gunned somebody. He has a gun. We saw the series before when Sutik came out. They have wall-mounted cannons and lasers and everything. They can probably risk releasing it on the floor and being like, all right, show me how fake it is, and just scaring him into it. Bearing in mind that they later just taser it. It's not like a Dalek. It's not code red in the list of monsters that they've probably got locked away. Someone watching us like, okay, yeah, I'll call this bluff. Prove this alien's wrong. We're releasing it out. You can take off his mask now. Show the world on your live stream what's going on. I know an interview with Pete McTeague about going forward into his, I think he's doing the spin-off show.
He's half writing The War Between Land and Sea, yeah.
The consequences of this will be shown in that. But I'm thinking the other way of handling that situation is a unit officer just shoots him in the head. It's kind of controlled. It's not the worst case scenario. It's not in Trafalgar Square. They could probably stop a Sheik. So I think just laying it out and be like, all right then, it's not the most insane decision that UNIT have ever taken.
I think Lucky Day would have been better served if it was just more about the way that people like him can have influence on people in society. He sort of gets to that. He has his podcast, radio show, whatever.
Think Tank talking of continuity references. That's a shout out to Tom Baker's first story, Robot. It's a nice subtle reference that you don't have to get.
Yeah, I didn't get it. Case in point.
Proving the point, yeah.
But I think it just loses sight of itself once it is. Let's confront him with the literal truth of what he says is a lie and what does he learn from that. And then he ends up becoming instrumental to the Rani's plan. The problem is there's not a lot of depth there for me to even try and figure out what it's trying to get at.
It is about anti-vax skepticism.
Yes, there's that.
He refuses to take the cure for the Shriek, even though the Shriek is very obviously real. But the problem with that is, if that's the case, then UNIT are standing in for the WHO. If UNIT are standing in for the WHO in your metaphor, it's a bad metaphor, because the WHO do not keep giant crates full of space lions on hand so they can release them if people get a little bit too crazy.
Yeah, they don't expose people to a virus to prove that a virus exists.
Yes.
UNIT are essentially Star Trek terms. They're the red shirts. Because people had to get exterminated or shot by Autons or whatever. They had to be someone. That was their role in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, etc.
Now they're all the Doctor's mates, so we can't kill any of them.
It's an odd thing to work in. There's a giant Avengers Tower in London and they're just kind of free to do whatever.
Yeah.
Once you try to apply real-world logic to unit dating is the big thing. Even trying to date when the Third Doctor stories take place in terms of continuity and canon is impossible, because unit just do not make sense. I don't mind, because unit generally just show up, do some stuff, and provide exposition. They provide, like, framework where the Doctor is on Earth and needs a bunch of people around to help him, and he needs an army or he needs soldiers, so I guess unit will fill that gap. Problem is when you try to make a story about unit, and this is the thing going into the war between land and sea, I am very curious about that. I'm kind of hoping that it's like Torchwood Children of Earth. The best case scenario is that it is a standalone thing that works really well as a science fiction drama on its own terms. But part of me is also like, I don't know that Unit can withstand that scrutiny in the way that Torchwood could, because as Craig's point, the show is skeptical of Torchwood. Whereas Doctor Who was initially skeptical of Unit, the Brigadier and John Pertwee didn't get along in their first season, but because they've been around so long, they're now the best buds, and they're now, as you say, the Doctor's best friends, and they're part of the institution of Doctor Who.
Davies avoided them in his first run largely, didn't he? They were in, 1-2 stories?
They're in quite a few.
But they don't have a face.
That's exactly it. That was Moffat's big innovation, was figuring out they needed a face.
Davies came up with Torchwood in order to do the unit thing back then. So you could have that morally murky organisation that weren't sanctioned by anybody.
Yes, and we're smaller. The big innovation of Torchwood is that they're plucky outsiders, whereas UNIT was initially the United Nations Intelligence Task Force, although now they're the Unified Intelligence Task Force. Although I think, are they now again the United Nations because they report to Geneva? I don't know. Anyway, it is what it is. But UNIT are the big institution that work in global politics, whereas Torchwood, to Davy's point, could be plucky outsiders who hang out in Cardiff because that's where we're filming.
Apart from in Torchwood Tower, Canary Wharf.
It only appears once. Torchwood Tower only appears once. It appears to get dismantled.
We're meeting essentially the X-Files gang with Torchwood. We're meeting the weird ones, the ones in the basement in Cardiff Division.
Yeah, the basement.
Yeah. And that worked, well, didn't entirely work, but it worked conceptually as a thing to have in the Doctor Who universe. And it allows you to do the, not that it was on the level of Andor, but it allows you to do the Andor thing of telling the stories that the parent show could never tell.
Yeah, Children of Earth is great because it's a Doctor Who story without Doctor Who in it. It's a story where the Doctor doesn't turn up. What happens if you do a Doctor Who story where the Doctor isn't there? And it goes so far wrong.
Jack wants to be the Doctor, but he's very bad at it.
Yeah, it's such a great concept and it's done so well and so interesting. And that's why I'm so interested in the war between land and sea, is because it feels like it's the Sea Devils, but without the Doctor. It feels like it's the Silurians and the Sea Devils, but without the Doctor in them. That is an incredible concept for a show. But again, to your point about UNIT, even in the Moffat era, they were in the basement. They were underneath the Tower of London or whatever, and it was a bunch of people at computers. You had a couple of army people show up in the Zygon Invasion, Zygon Inversion, but it was not a standard tactical military organization. There was nobody like Ibrahim whose job is to stand around with a big gun and hang around and threaten to shoot things, but never do.
In Davies' Sontaran episodes that were kind of just in the way.
Yeah, and they're also part of World War III and Aliens of London.
Yeah, that was the one I was thinking of, because I'd forgotten briefly about the Sontaran thing, but I was thinking of UNIT are mentioned there, and their logos on the submarine missile launcher thing.
And they appear in Journey's End, where the Osterhagen key is like UNIT thing as well.
Yeah, because Martha works for them.
Yeah.
Is it Lee Evans?
Yes, you're right. Pops up in Planet of the Dead as well. There's that attempt in Davies' first run to establish it. I just think that he doesn't crack it rather than he's not trying to do it. He does try several times, but he can't get traction. I think it is Moffat who lands on, we need Kate Stewart. We need a face. And we need Osgood as well, and we need particular faces that we can hang around and stick around with. And Davies just kind of doubling down on that with this, where you have an entire staff of UNIT that could support their own spin-off and probably will.
Yeah, and Kate, who just hires anybody that can do something. Anita stands with a door open, and Kate's like, I like your style. Do you want to work for me? All she's done is hold a door open. You don't know anything else.
Also, she looks like she's a bit older than the average UNIT recruitment rating, to be fair. I do love that Kate is very obviously learning from the Doctor, where the 15th Doctor is all about reuniting parents and children, and Kate is like, what if we just hire the children?
Ruby, she works for UNIT in that series, doesn't she? It's not massively clear kind of role she
Well,
does.
she's hanging around the office. She's hanging around UNIT Tower in Lucky Day. So presumably she is working for UNIT. And she's passing on the cure from UNIT to Conrad. She goes on the podcast to give him the cure. And again, this is one of those things where Conrad is maybe a little justified in being skeptical of UNIT, given that UNIT didn't reach out to him and say, you should take the cure. They sent Ruby under the pretense of going to a podcast and then over dinner suggesting, by the way, you should take a cure. We've been watching you all along. If that happened to me, I would feel a little uncomfortable. I'd be like, why didn't you just tell me this from the start?
And Ruby's like, oh, this organisation that do some weird morally reprehensible things. Oh, they're great, by the way. UNIT are great. Don't worry about them.
Yeah, no questions.
Yeah, that's what happens when you're in your early 20s and you have your first job. You're like, yeah, this is amazing. They're paying me money. Yeah. I'll do anything.
It's like working at Goldman Sachs. This is Ruby's equivalent of working at Goldman Sachs. She's like, I've got no problems with how this... Do you know they have a really great kitchen?
Lucky Day is also kind of about the Doctor Who fandom and the flip side of it, where you have the very positive portrayal of the Doctor Who fandom, and well, I don't think it's that positive, actually. And we know we're annoying, but you have that in Lux, where the Doctor meets his fans.
Who all love Blink, by the way. In terms of jokes about Davies' ego, I do love that Davies has the Doctor meet his fans. They're like, yeah, we love the Stephen Moffat episode. That's the one that we love.
Yeah, they list all ones that he didn't write, don't they?
And you have the 50th Doctor go, but what about the one with the space bit? What about the ones that Davies wrote? And they're like, no, just to be clear, no.
Yeah, they're just a group of people that sit and they watch Doctor Who on a Saturday night, presumably, and they dress up and they identify as being annoying, which I thought was quite funny.
And again, if Davies' second era is about TV, and I think it is about TV, because obviously you have even Conrad using TV in Wishworld, in Lucky Day, that is the show grappling, as you said, with its own fandom. It kind of comes up in the Robot Revolution as well, with Al, who's like, I love classic 1950s science fiction, and I love video games, and therefore I'm going to turn the world into a gigantic video game that is dystopian and violent and horrific and causes lots of death. Where there is this sense of Davies taking ownership of Conrad, where Conrad is a classic Doctor Who fan or a classic revival Doctor Who fan. But we live in a world where fandom has become a path to radicalization politically. Is probably the best way to describe it, in terms of culture wars, in terms of video games, in terms of Star Wars, where there is this clear path towards taking angry young men who are angry that their franchises don't belong to them anymore. Conrad is just really pissed the Doctor never picked him up again. The Doctor kind of left his life and doesn't pander to him anymore. And then turning them into these radical political actors and having them become the people, to your point, who are on YouTube pushing these conspiracy theories and on YouTube undermining everything that we take for granted. I think Davies is kind of, to a certain extent, taking ownership of that, of being like, it is an issue that many of the people who loved my first tenure of Doctor Who then turned around and tweeted #NotMyDoctor the moment that the Doctor regenerated into a woman. That is something that is a problem with the show. That is something that's a problem with the show's fan base, to a certain extent. And to your point, it is mellowed out. It is cut against the very sincere, I think, affectionate portrayal of fans in Lux. I think the Lux fans are very affectionate towards Belinda, who becomes much more of a fan of Doctor Who over the course of the show, of the fans in the Interstellar Song Contest, who are enthusiastic and really fanish for that as well. But I do think that there is something very earnest and very sincere in Davies looking at Conrad and very pointedly having Conrad quote Kylo Ren from The Last Jedi. Have you come back to save my soul? Is that what you've come back to do? Which is a line from The Last Jedi. Insanely, we live in a world where the metastasizing of fandom into something toxic has actual real-world political consequences. And to that broader point about the Davies era and Davies' fixation on television, Davies' fixation on media, and it's something that plays out in The Giggle as well, where The Giggle is television and streaming and online stuff is being used to drive people mad. People are using the Alex Jones show or Fox News to turn people insane and to turn the heat up on culture and drive it to a boil, where it's, if media can produce people like Conrad, doesn't that create an obligation on media to do something like, to your point, to include people like Rose, or to include people like Shirley, or to include people like the broadcaster in the Interstellar Song Contest, to provide an alternative to that? And I do think Davies takes that idea relatively seriously. I think Davies is very cognizant of the fact that we should be trying not to produce Conrads. We should be trying to produce media that doesn't produce Conrads.
I agree. We should maybe talk about what our highlights of the season are, and lowlights as well, I guess. Isaac, what were your favourite things about this season, episodes-wise?
Definitely The Well was my top one. I did see 2 leaks ahead. So going in before Series 2, I did know the Midnight sequel was coming. I know people hold Midnight as, you don't touch that one. You got that one perfect in a 1.
Not the fans in Lux. They didn't mention it.
Yeah. I think I prefer this to Midnight. Midnight is a solid spooky idea, and I think the whole thing of turning your back on disadvantaged people is that whole thing we've been talking about. I think it's just very intense, atmospheric. The ending is amazing. I liked the jump scares and the flickers. I'm not a reviewer, I know you two are. I just watch things. So I'm not as in-depth when it comes to going into those sorts of reviews. But I just thought this was, like we say, like, you know, when you watch a good one, you're like, this is really impressive. This is one of the highlights of this show that I love. And I think, again, that has a lingering afterwards. You don't fully comprehend at the end. The lift has 3 people in, the passenger count is 4. I had extra questions on, someone pointing out on Twitter recently, when you put the helmets on, the light come on, but when they do put hers on at the end, the lights don't come on. Is there things there? Because essentially the creature, as far as we can tell, much like in Midnight, it wins again. It gets what it wants, essentially. I like that they flesh out a little more. I know people got quite upset because it changed its rules, but you don't play the same game all the time. It's cruel and malicious, and it has fun with the people it has fun with.
Well, the Cybermen changed their game pretty much every appearance. The Cybermen changed dramatically between their first and second appearances. Weeping Angels do the same.
If you are doing a sequel to Midnight, you can't be like, we're on the next bus and the same thing happens. You have to do it differently. I just thought it was a very intense and wonderful one. I don't have low lights. I still don't think I get the story in the engine. You can tell it's quite lyrical and it's definitely a different writing style and there's lots of very lovely things in it. I've watched it twice now. Maybe I just need to give it a few more goes. There's the Worlds of Gods. The bit at the end is really lovely where the Doctor's like a barber shop. There's 15 voices all chattering away and telling their stories and stuff. There's so much lovely stuff in it. But I think it's one that, much like with Boom and 74 Yards last year, everyone got way more out of it. And I was like, oh, that was kind of nice. Or with Through the Last Years, I was like, that was okay. But people got a lot out of them. I think I didn't quite get that one. I know we sort of talked, you haven't used classic monsters, no Sontarans or Daleks or whatever. I do miss monsters. Not necessarily returning monsters, just a horde of something. They're releasing a colouring book, I think, they've advertised on Twitter, and it's got the robots from the Robot Revolution. There needs a bit of that. We need things to run down corridors from. There's been a few that said there's the robots, there was not things, and the big praying mantises from the Star Beast.
Not Mr. Ringading? Mr. Ringading feels like he broke out of Doctor Who fandom into broader internet culture, which is kind of incredible.
He has, yeah.
A meme, basically.
He has acquired depth.
A complexity, a third dimension.
I think it's more, I'm going back to when I was a dorky kid, trying to get people to like Doctor Who. Someone has to play the Daleks, someone has to play the Doctor, and there's chasing and running around. I feel like this misses a little bit of how do people play it? How do people make their own stories with Mr. Ringading? It's nice to fire up the imagination, and especially with kids, it's good to give them a few toys to play with.
Well, you said that you felt like the season was largely set in one room most of the episodes, didn't you?
A few of those, definitely with, much as like Lux and The Well, it is very much the Doctor and Belinda with Lux.
In a cinema or in the well, yeah.
In a cinema room. Same feeling with Boom last year. It feels like not it could be on a stage or it could be a play, but it feels very, it's here and now. It's a real-time thing that's happening with the story of the engine as well. It's all set. The barbershop and a few people. It just feels a little small and insular. I mean, there is some stories. The Insular Song Contest is massive and has that amazing, like you were saying, Doctor Who doing stuff that hasn't seen before. First seeing it the next time trailer, the body's going...
It feels massive, but it's a couple of rooms in a corridor.
That's it. It's a corridor shot from multiple angles and lit in different ways.
Doctor Who's always corridor shot from multiple angles.
But on the other hand, we do have the Dugadoo.
And we have the Dugadoo. Poor Belinda trying to make sense of the world and the worst crazy frog style things just going on in the background.
But that's Doctor Who in a nutshell. The moment where Belinda's just screaming and shouting and the Dugadoo is playing over it. It's the perfect encapsulation of camp and gritty that I think that episode is trying to do. It's the one point where that episode really works for me. The, oh my god, I'm never going to see my family again with the stupidest CGI animal you can imagine in the background.
It's a weird pinging. So I think not necessarily as a low light episode, but I think one thing that I'm feeling that I'm missing a bit is I want a base under siege. I want a horde of something. I want an invasion. I want lots of something. It's part of what we used to get. We used to get in a spaceship full of Sontarans flying in, or it could be a brand new monster. It could be the somethings of planet whatever. It doesn't have to be pre-established, but just a big lot of something showing up. I do kind of miss that a bit.
The Well was an interesting one for me because I really enjoyed the episode. I thought it was really good, but I felt like the Midnight sequel of it all overpowered it slightly. I just didn't feel like that was a necessary thing. The Midnight entity changing its operation is neither here nor there. And it did make me think of the Weeping Angels, actually, when you have them in Blink, and the threatening thing about them is they send you back in time and you just have to get back to your own time the slow way. And for human beings, that means it's the rest of your life. But then they show up in that two-parter and they're just breaking people's necks. That's less interesting to me. And I think what the Midnight entity was doing was actually equally terrifying, but also it didn't really need to be the Midnight entity. That was one of the not written by Davies episodes, wasn't it?
Well, that was one of those rewritten by Davies episodes. I think the implication is that Davies had to do a quick polish on it, or a very thorough rewrite of it.
One of the interesting things about it is it seems that Doctor Who's been around long enough that it's nostalgic for its revival. And now we're in another revival and we're getting nostalgia for that era. And we're getting, as much as, say, the Daleks were brought back by Davies, you're getting other writers coming onto the show and bringing back the Midnight Monster. This is the show for me back when it first appeared.
Doctor Who's kind of always done that. The Mara comes back very quickly. Again, this is one of those, if you're placing bets for the villain of season 16, I guess the Mara is the only other major.
Oh, I guess the Mara could show up, yeah.
But every once in a while, the show would do an insane thing like bring back the most obscure, weird villain from a couple of years ago because apparently it had broken through or broken out or whatever. It's like, I guess we have to do a sequel to Kinda or whatever, Kinda. But The Well feels to me like it's part of that larger conversation about nostalgia that's running through the season.
It's notable that the Midnight Planet has been strip mined. It's been robbed of anything of value.
Yeah. It's been harvested and exploited. And again, you have Alan in the Robot Revolution who's creating this nostalgic fantasy of hard 50s science fiction. You have Conrad who's yearning to take things back to the way they were, this very conservative perspective on it. We mentioned the idea of Omega, but the idea of Sutek as this idea of the past is death and the past is suffocating us. One of the things I like about the remaking of the Rules of the Well is that it isn't just that you have to stand behind Alice, it's that you have to be standing behind Alice relative to an observer. So there's a point early in the episode where she turns around and nobody dies. That's because there's nobody on the other side of her to see the other person behind her. The Doctor explains it as you have to be standing at midnight of a clock, but that only makes sense. Midnight of a clock is the way Alice is facing. If Alice is the clock, midnight is right in front of her. There has to be somebody observing her for midnight to be behind her. It is incredibly convoluted, but I actually think it's very smart because it's about observation. It's about this idea of watching and looking like so much of the season is, because so much of the season's about this idea of constructing a version of reality that is seen and watched and perceived.
I guess you die at tea time isn't effective as a line either.
You die at 6 p.m. Yeah, you die at exactly 6 p.m.
You die when The Simpsons comes on.
I forgave the invocation of the Midnight Creature. The Midnight Creature becomes the idea of continuity, this thing on your back that is always behind. It reminded me more of the Tur Left thing, where there's something at your back but I can't quite see it, which is very, very, very evocative of the Turn Left Beetle. So it's kind of weird that the two are combined into one another, but I kind of took that to be the show playing with nostalgia, playing with this idea of, can we bring this thing back? What is the most ridiculous sequel episode we could do?
Yeah, and then, like I said, the whole strip mining of the planet of Midnight, it used to be this beautiful tourist destination that people came from across the universe to see, and now it's a hole in the ground. It's nothing.
IP fracking. We're in the IP mines.
Over a long enough timeline, that's just what happens to things, I guess. People try and extract everything of value until there's nothing left, and that's not what Davies wants Doctor Who to be, I suppose. So I liked it in the abstract. I liked the episode on the whole, but I still felt it got overpowered by It's Midnight. And we're back here again. But I also kind of forgave it because the finale accepted once again. It's not really doing that all the time. Every episode isn't, well, I'm revisiting that thing I knew about. The standard thing in Doctor Who is the companion will go, what's this, Doctor? And the Doctor will be like, it's this. I encountered them 1 billion years ago or whatever.
Or Empire of Death, where they stop and watch the episode. Where they stop and watch Sutek's previous appearance.
Yeah. School Reunion, for example, the Krillitane, I don't know if they were ever in the show before, but the Doctor was like, I've seen them before because I've been around. I encounter everything and have a working knowledge of what pretty much everything in the universe is. There's a few things I'll be like, I don't know what this is, but I'll find out. The story in the engine, I found it quite interesting actually because I saw a conversation online, and it's going to sound really weird for me to say this, but it feels like white people didn't get it. And I say this on a podcast of 3 white people, but particularly white men didn't seem to gravitate to it. And I'm not saying that's a flaw in them as such, but I wonder if that's the episode doing exactly what it was trying to do, represent a point of view that...
Yeah, bringing in our Willems, it's bringing in a person of colour to write for a Doctor of colour. It's very deliberate, yeah. Yeah,
it's representing a point of view that you wouldn't, not you, the royal you, wouldn't necessarily understand immediately.
I'll accept the specific you.
Yeah, you, Darren, you didn't understand it.
Me specifically, I'm willing to own it, yeah.
But like you said, Isaac, you might take a few goes to really get it. And maybe that's the point. Maybe you have that yearning to understand it, but you didn't initially. To me, I looked at it as, what if the stories stop? That seems like the threat of the episode.
And to your point, that looming threat of cancellation, I think Isaac mentioned it as well. The idea of Locke's, limited engagement. There is this idea of the show being, I think, conscious of the possibility of its own cancellation. The threat of the story in the engine is you just stop telling stories. What happens if you just stop telling stories? We will never run out of Doctor Who stories, is the end of the episode. Is how the Doctor resolves the crisis at the end. It did feel very Moffat-y. It did feel very much something like Hyde, which is we're all stories in the end. Let's make sure it's a good one. To Isaac's point, I really liked the lyricism of it. I really liked that it felt kind of poetic, which is appropriate given that it comes from a poet. I also like that Illams quotes his own work. That Yo-Yo Ma's story is from his own book of poetry. I think it's called Fuck Time. It's a really great poem. I hardly recommend reading it. It's based on, I can't remember who the guy is who went on the tour of Botswana with Yo-Yo Ma, but he told this story and Illams basically turned it into this poem, which is just really beautiful. Fuck Time, give it a Google. It's well worth checking out. But I love that he plagiarized himself in his own episode. I love that so much.
And the Doctor saying that he's watched all the Marvel movies. God, there's going to be some bizarre things he's going to notice.
I do also like that, again, so much of this show seems to be in conversation with Disney. The Robot Revolution looks very Star Warsian at times. You have Loki. Very pointedly, the Doctor mentions that he's met all the other gods, but he's like, and Loki, who I've never met, because we can't get that crossover to work, even though Kate Herron wrote an episode of last season. But I do love that the show does seem to be in conversation with its place in the Disney canon. The lead character is called Belle.
What did the Doctor think when he watched Thor the Dark World? Or
Kilgrave. Did he watch the Netflix shows? Did that count?
yeah, sees Jenna Coleman in The First Avenger and just starts crying. Or Karen Gillan in Guardians of the Galaxy. All these Doctor Who actors that have turned up in Marvel stuff.
Watching Jessica Jones and wondering, why did I choose that face? Why did that face come back?
Just turns out she watched Jessica Jones the night before, and then it was just on her mind. Shooty Gatwa, after Eurovision, decided to listen to some Billy Piper. That's what conjured that.
Because he wants to.
Isaac, do you have any other highlights or not so highlights you wanted to mention?
Archie Panjabi is a brilliant Rani. It's a short run on the screen, but as a pro Rani person, I thought it was really fantastic. Mrs. Flood was also, she's been building up over this 2 years.
I'm not convinced she was always supposed to be the Rani.
No, nor am I.
Yeah, I think keeping her just as Mrs. Flood. She's not really named the Rani too much in the episode. She's a Rani.
The narrative somersaults they were pulling. Yes, then I got that blonde in your crosshairs and whatever. And then I moved next door to Belinda.
I think a really good performance, and I know people were a bit either confused or this feels tacked on the mid-credits. I was like, nah, it's sick. No, it's great. Jodie works as my doctor, so her showing up was fantastic. And I really enjoyed that.
What do you think of all the people saying that's the best she's ever been written?
It's rubbish. She's the same. It's exactly the same as everything she's always in. I love how easily she just comes back. The first she does, she's a classic raising her arms like, what are you doing? In terms of lowlights, we haven't really talked about Joy to the World. I don't really like Doctor Who Christmas specials. And I think watching anything at Christmas is just kind of a chore, because at Christmas at home with your family, the rule seems to be, or at least in my family, you can talk over anything as long as it's not Wallace and Gromit. But it's treated as sort of background noise when you're digesting. I recently did try and watch it again for this. It's like, Christmas specials, they don't really excite me too much, so I don't think I'd revisit Joy to the World too much. I didn't dislike Wish World as much as you did, Craig. It's a part 1 of 2, but I think watching it and then having to wait a week, it didn't drum up too much excitement. The name drop Omega, which I was sort of aware of, and London starts to collapse and things, but it did turn it off. They're like, okay, then on to next week we go. The first 3, I think that was a really solid 1, 2, 3, like a really amazing opener, especially after a series that was a bit more lukewarm on last year. Coming back in, like, we're in the good stuff now. It's really full steam ahead on the show. And I don't think there was any stories I disliked. There was just a few where it's like, these are really great stories. And some were like, okay, that's nice. It's still a good show. I'm still watching on Saturday, but it isn't sitting with me forever. They're not all absolute masterpieces. Some of them need a nice 45-ish minutes of the show that I love, and that's fine. And even ones like Lucky Day, they got a bit sort of tied up. It's like, well, can't all be winners. I still remember thinking when they announced you're getting a Chibnall era writer and they picked Pete McTeague, I was like, oh,
Not him.
no Joy Wilkinsons, no Vinay Patel. So, yeah, I'm intrigued to see what the War Between Land of the Sea is. I know the Sea Devils is the big rumour, or it's a underwater species.
Well, it's fairly confirmed.
If it is the Sea Devils.
I assume it's fairly confirmed. It's an underwater species. It would have to be the Sea Devils.
Except they're hot now because they don't want to cover up the actress too much.
Yeah, I do like the Salon into Sea Devils. I always found those very interesting stories. But I don't know if they confirmed it was them or if it was just another Atlantis or something like that.
Another Atlantis. I like that. One of the 4 Atlantises.
Another Atlantis. We have many Atlantises. The fish people from, I think, Patrick Troughton or William Hartnell era. There were some fish people. I wouldn't say I cannot wait for that one. Again, just because we don't know. It could be this year. It could be 2026. It's one of those things. I'll get excited when it's coming out. But for now, it's nice that they're doing a thing. I think it's brilliant they're making the CBeebies animated thing just because it's a different thing. It's using this compassion and goodness of the character of the Doctor, scaling it right back for young children and introducing them as an idol growing up. There really is no one better than the Doctor in just terms of treating everyone with kindness and respect and going in with 2 hearts full.
Unless you're
I think bringing that down to kids aged 3 and stuff is a wonderful idea. So I'm very happy that that's, even if that is just like, yeah, we're just doing that for a bit. Probably won't tune in, but I think it's a nice way for them to branch out the audience and get people into the world and giving them the right things as helping to grow and develop. I mean, that's lovely.
They're the people that will need to carry on the fandom of the show at some point, aren't they? People of that age.
Get them young.
The new unit recruitment show is yet to be seen.
That's it, exactly, yeah.
There's going to be some toddler division of unit that Kate's going to...
Don't believe his lies looking at a baby across the way. I'm surprised that she didn't try to hire the baby from the finale. For God, we could take him on. We got room.
They need to wait for him to be of age first.
So 2.5, yeah.
That's a couple of years. Once the first few words are in, that'll be it. It's interesting you say with Joy to the World because I didn't get on with it massively when I first watched it, but I watched it on Boxing Day and I was half asleep and I just wasn't inclined to engage my brain for very much. But when I rewatched it, I got along with it much better. I found the COVID story very poignant and I thought the Doctor going the slow way around with Anita was an excellent collection of scenes. I thought that was a really earnest and lovely little relationship that he cultivated with this normal person. And I put her in the notes as the almost companion, but I don't think she was ever going to be a companion. I think that was the point, the idea of someone that he spends time with, and that was perfect for him at that point. And I also loved the scene where he chastises himself. This is why nobody likes you. You don't tell anybody anything. Textbook enigmatic, just yelling at himself. I think it was a great scene.
Do you want to point out as well, just as a coffee guy, it's pumpkin spiced latte. Every time he said pumpkin latte, I ground my teeth. Silly little nitpick. But it's milk. It's not made of pumpkin.
Also, by the time the person who needed it gets it, it's cold. It's way cold.
I mean, we do Deliveroo at work. It's always going to be cold. That's not the most science fiction thing.
Yeah, but it was up the top of Everest at one point.
Put it in the TARDIS microwave. It's fine.
Darren, what were your highlights / lowlights?
Just to jump off some stuff that Isaac said there, the Archie Punjabi thing I like because it's a very much in the spirit of the stunt casting of this era of casting Neil Patrick Harris as the toy maker, casting Jinx Monsoon, casting Jonathan Groff in Rogue, casting these characters and actors who are known for queer representation. Archie Punjab is straight, but she very famously played one of the rare bisexual characters to appear on American primetime television when she appeared in The Good Wife. So I thought that was very good casting. I do also, like yourself, Greg, want to stand up for Joy to the World. I think that Davies handing over the Christmas special to Moffat was the smartest decision, or one of the smartest decisions that he made, because I think Moffat is very, very good at that stuff. I think Moffat's Christmas specials generally work better than Davies, because Moffat is more in tune with the idea of the holiday, as opposed to Davies being like, no, we should do a big, stupid spectacle. It should be a big pantomime episode, whereas Moffat is more like, well, what is Christmas about, to a certain extent?
Voyage of the Damned is my favourite Christmas special, though.
Okay, fair. But again, that's predicated on what kind of television do we show at Christmas. When Moffat tries to do that, you get The Return of Dr. Mysterio, which is nowhere near as good, because Moffat doesn't care about Superman as a character. So when he tries to do it, it's like, I don't really have a strong take on this. But in terms of just stuff that I liked about it, we maybe haven't talked enough about Lux. The idea of using the Disney money to do Lux. There is no way that Lux would have got made if it weren't for the Disney deal. One of the things that I like about the Davies 2.0 era is the burning of a Disney budget on just stuff that the show would do anyway. He's not using the Disney budget to create CGI armies of Sontarans or Daleks or Cybermen or whatever. He's instead using it to do things like Mr. Ring-a-Ding, for example, or in Boom to build a set of a quarry instead of shooting in an actual quarry, where it is almost comically malfeasant to use the Disney money in the way that Davies does, which I find really, really, really very charming. I like The Well. I think The Well suffers because it's in the Boom slot. It is the hard, militaristic, Verhoeven-esque science fiction episode, and it's just, for my mind, not as good as Boom, but I think it's great. I think it's a lot of fun, and I liked it a lot. Also, the story in the engine, we talked about, I love that very much, and the idea of it being a show that is a story about story. I do want to single out Wishworld. I know you didn't like Wishworld, Craig. I really, really, really liked Wishworld because it felt to me like it was kind of a thesis statement to a certain extent for what Davies was doing with this return to the show. Obviously, you have this idea of media is important, and television is important, and stories are important, and the world that we create is important. Wishworld for me was the most literal representation of that, where you have Uncle Connie on television interrupting the Doctor Who theme song, for example. But you have this idea of we create the image of the world on television, and that image manifests itself on reality. And when we create this suffocating heteronormative world, it is destructive and harmful. And the really clever idea that the Rani makes, which is the idea that the fantasy world that Conrad wants to create, which is not that different from the fantasy world that so much of the modern political right wants to create, to get back to that idea of the show having things to say about this moment, is not sustainable. The world that these people want to create, the Make America Great Again world, or the Take Back Control world, is not something that can ever exist because it is a lie, and any attempt to manifest that lie on reality is inherently going to implode and destroy and blow itself up, because there are inconsistencies and things that cannot be reconciled within that. I found that was a really strong expression of Davies' fascination with the power of television. What if you take something and make it real? How Conrad makes that world real is by reading a J.K. Rowling book to a child. It's the idea that you have media, and the media that you feed children will teach those children what is possible and the world that they will conjure into being. And at the risk of making Doctor Who sound horribly self-important, or Davies sound horribly self-important, there is that sense of Davies being like, but that creates an earnest weight and responsibility on me running Doctor Who to help children imagine a more diverse world, or a better world, because if you don't, you're just going to end up creating this suffocating, very limited, very heteronormative perspective. I think we brought it up when we talked about the first season, and I'm wary of doing this as a straight guy, but there is I think something about Davies in this season dealing with reproductive futurism, and in particular the idea of queer reproductive futurism. As much as this season sets up Susan and doesn't deal with Susan at all, because it's very clear that he was going to deal with Susan in season 3 or whatever, there is something very satisfying to me about the resolution of the Susan and Poppy arc that runs through the show, where the show tricks you into thinking that Poppy is real and Poppy is the Doctor's daughter in a biological sense. And you have that conversation with the Rani at the start of Reality War, where she is half Time Lord or whatever, where the Doctor wishes to be Poppy's parent so that he is. But you have this really interesting argument in Reality War that you do not have to be the biological parent of a child to be a father. You don't have to produce a child through heteronormative sexual intercourse to be that child's parent, which is, to me, a really important thematic point in that this is a show that is aimed at children. One of the things I like about Wishworld and Reality War is that it is a story about how unconventional family units are valid and important, and they matter, even when we are living in a time where Disney is erasing queer characters from their shows, where they're erasing trans representation from episodes of Devil Dinosaur, or deleting subplots from Win or Lose, the Pixar spin-off, where Belinda is a single mother, and that is perfectly fine. She is not judged. She does not need a husband in order to be a mother. But the Doctor, who is, and I know there is some debate about whether the Doctor was always queer or is always queer, and we can talk about 13, we can talk about 14, making reference to whether or not he's gay, but I think it is safe to say that Gatwa's 15th Doctor is the first openly queer Doctor, in that he's the first to have an actual romance with a character of the same sex in Rogue, for example. But the idea of the show finally unraveling the question of Susan, which is this question that has dangled over the show since its very beginning. Susan is introduced as the granddaughter of the Doctor before the show has even mentioned the word Time Lords or Gallifrey or regeneration or any of the concepts that will go. As far as the show is concerned, when Susan is introduced, the Doctor is an old human guy who happens to be from the future, and his granddaughter is just his granddaughter. You don't need to explain it. And as the show progresses, and as you add lore on top of that, as the Doctor regenerates, as he becomes something new, as you introduce the mythology of Gallifrey and the Time Lords, Susan becomes this mystery that you have to explain, you have to solve, which is, how can the Doctor have a granddaughter? What is the relationship between the Doctor and the granddaughter? Where is the Doctor's children, his daughters, his sons? Where's the missing generation here? And I like that Davies deals with that with the first openly queer Doctor by saying, sorry, at the risk of simplifying this, it is none of your business, basically. Poppy can be the Doctor's daughter in the same way that, as Kate says, we are all the Doctor's children. And Susan can be the Doctor's granddaughter without having to be biologically related to him. Because again, Davies is an openly queer writer who, as he's gone on in his career, has become more willing to engage with that queerness and what it means to be an older gay man, writing things like It's a Sin, for example, dealing with the AIDS crisis. The thing I really like about Wishworld and Reality War is this idea that the Doctor can be a father and a grandfather without having to A, worry about looms if you're worried about canon, but also B, have to ask questions about where's the Doctor's wife or where's the Doctor's children. If Susan is his granddaughter, who's his son or his daughter? I really like that Davies ties that into this idea of family is such a diverse, porous term that can exist in multiple ways, and that there is no single right way to have a family despite what Conrad thinks, despite how Conrad imagines pushing Belinda and the Doctor together to make sure that Belinda has a husband and that the Doctor has a daughter. I like that the show embraces this really, for me, enthusiastic reproductive futurist view of you can have a family unit that doesn't conform to that. I like that a lot.
Even you have Ruby, who's the adopted daughter of a lesbian black woman. So her gran is no biological connection whatsoever, but that doesn't make it any less of her gran and mother.
But it's still her gran, yeah. And it's such an elegant way of squaring what has been, again, to get back to the Davies thing, it is a Gordinian knot of continuity. And Davies just slices through it by saying, actually what's important is that they're family. That's the only thing you need to know. You don't need to legislate it. All you need to know is that Susan is the Doctor's granddaughter. Anything else is none of your business.
There was some strange choices in the finale, though. You had Belinda just, I'm going to go stand in a box with Poppy and let everybody else do everything, which meant she disappeared for a chunk of the episode. And then there was the weird almost gleeful reaction to, I'm unburdened by a child, let's go and explore the universe.
I actually found that really unsettling, the continuous folding of the jacket until it didn't exist. That was one of the most unsettling images of the season for me.
Apparently there's evidence of a reshoot there where the Doctor's in the know. He winks at Ruby as if to say, I know that I'm just saying this, but obviously it changes.
My gut feeling is that Belinda's departure was always going to involve her being reunited with Poppy. It was just whether or not that was going to be pushed out. When Ruby has that conversation where she's, Poppy was right here, and the Doctor winks at her, that's if to say, I'm playing along with this to spare Belinda the erasure of her daughter. And I'm like, there is no way that Davies' third season plan didn't end with Belinda and Poppy reunited. And again, for all my problems with the reality war as an episode of television, the 15th Doctor is introduced reuniting Ruby and her mother in the church on Ruby Road, and he regenerates reuniting Poppy with her mother Belinda in the reality war. It's not an airtight character arc like the 9th Doctor has, but it's arguably better symmetry than the 10th Doctor got, for example.
It reminded me a bit of Forest of the Dead, because Donna had a daughter in the simulation, didn't she? And she had to just get over the fact that...
It's not real, yeah.
Yeah, it's not real. So I felt like that was pulling a similar move.
Again, the Moffat influence on the season, yeah.
Yeah, but I wasn't clear on whether Poppy was supposed to be a fiction created by that world that is put right when erased, or whether it was this 1 degree off reality all along that we were in, where Poppy didn't exist. It was very muddled.
And it's hard to reconcile that because Poppy pops up in the story in the Engine, which predates the Rani's regeneration, for example. And you have Poppy Honey in the Interstellar Song Contest. But you also have Poppy, who's the character from Space Babies. Is this Captain Poppy? Did Conrad somehow reach across time and plug? Yeah. How does that make sense? A lot of this stuff is Davies. It's thematic. You just have to feel it. But my general vibe is that in Lux, you have the mother in the restaurant who has lost her son. And that's the first encounter Belinda has with an adventure. And then in The Well, you have Alice, who's like, my daughter is at home being babysat by her grandparent. And that's exactly what happens at the end of Reality War. And you have little things like you mentioned, the idea of Poppy popping up in the story in the Engine, where Belinda, who has not met Captain Poppy, sees Poppy in the story in the Engine, which would imply that she has some prior connection to her. We'll never know in terms of reshoots and stuff like that. My gut feeling is that based on the text, we are meant to have understood that Poppy always existed. Because you have that line for the Doctor, you were always coming home to Poppy. We have been seeing a season that is 1 degree off reality. The 7 meters in the border between Norway and Finland, or Ernest Borgnine is still alive, or I'm guessing Mavity as well. Very consciously, the reality of the show is kind of elastic, as we pointed out. The only way that I can make sense of it is to imagine that Poppy was always real.
Yeah, the funniest thing is when you get that revised montage of all the adventures and Belinda talking about Poppy, all I could think of is, oh God, she's like that person at work that won't shut up about her kids.
No wonder the Doctor just blanked it.
No one is as interested in your kids as you are. So the best that you're going to get out of people is they're just going to kind of nod along and be like, oh, that's nice. And that's how I felt watching that montage. I was like, God, she talks a lot about this Poppy. Isaac, what did you think of the ending in terms of Belinda and Poppy?
I didn't worry too much about continuity or whatever. Having that bookmark shooting Atwood's eras, much like David Tennant's first generation. I like that sometimes it's just about saving one person, and it's okay, but it's not okay enough because we've lost someone. They're willing to lose this face to set things right and get them back in the world. So I thought that was a nice Doctor send-off for Shooty Gatwell. It was a very Doctor way to go. And it's one of those things, if you do pull it apart, I'm sure it doesn't hold up incredibly well, but the overall point being that it's about sustaining life, and it doesn't necessarily have to be how did Poppy exist or the space baby shape and all that. It's more just about, in the same way that Belinda's face shows up in
Boom as Monday Flynn.
The Priests, yeah, Monday Flynn. I suppose with this one, it is Poppy. It's not an actor who's doing a different role, but it was a nice way of ending with. She has a family, putting things right to get the family. I was a little bit worried the first time he wakes up post-generation in the garden. I was like, I was going to meet David Tennant again. It was nice being Jodie Whittaker. I was going to now go meet Donna and that again.
He has lunch with Donna and the 14th Doctor.
We talked about the Davies finales, and I drew a connection to Last of the Time Lords with the reality war in the sense of the Doctor talking about, oh, we have a child. It was weird, the conversation him and Belinda were having about travelling the universe as parents, and they both just kind of accepted that some wish created a biological child from the two of us, and we're just okay with that. That doesn't feel violating in any way or whatever. But the way the Doctor was talking about it, we can't take her anywhere dangerous or whatever, and it seems to be the show's active resistance to changing its own status quo. So in Last of the Time Lords, they defeated the Master, and it was the only safe place for him is in the TARDIS. Maybe I've wandered too long. And of course, 2 minutes later, the Master is shot and killed, therefore meaning the Doctor can restore his own status quo and continue on. It used to happen in Star Trek all the time. There'd be the suggestion of a life-changing thing for one of the characters, and then circumstances would step in and mean that that can't happen. And that's what was happening in Doctor Who, although it hasn't done that often, actually. It hasn't gone with the suggestion of maybe this is where the journey ends for me. It's done it a few times, but not as often as you might think. But yeah, I was just thinking about the universe's resistance to the Doctor actually changing in any meaningful way.
That's Davies to the core. It is the difference between Davies and Moffat. Moffat does give the Doctor arcs. The Doctor does change under Moffat, theoretically.
Yeah, it's the Avengers Age of Ultron thing. Tony Stark is working to end the Avengers. That's what his goal is.
Yeah, whereas Captain America is like, no, we just fight them at the next battle. That's what we do. We just keep fighting the war. The war never ends.
And Disney's all about, we can't end the Avengers, and the BBC / Bad Wolves / Disney might be like, well, we can't end Doctor Who. Well, maybe Disney think that they can. It was just a similar idea of, this is going to change the way that I live. I can't do this anymore. The closest you get is David Tennant saying, I'm going to base myself somewhere. I'm not going to be adventuring in the way that I used to. But he can do that because he bigenerated.
You also arguably have the 12th Doctor trying it at the start of the 10th season when he tries to settle down and guard Missy in the vault, which is in some ways an extension of that conversation at the end of The Last of the Time Lords. But the whole point of that is that's the start of the season, so inevitably
Can't do it.
he can't do it, yeah.
Well, ultimately it ends the way it starts, doesn't it? With the Doctor alone and travelling. Or not quite. I imagine whatever the Billy Piper of it all ends up being, that's what we'll get to.
I do like the 15th Doctor opens the door so he doesn't blow up the very expensive TARDIS set that they built.
We're just going to project all the energy outwards.
Just lean out a little bit, yeah. Some poor ship flying by just gets hit by a blast of regeneration energies.
How do you feel about Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor overall now we've had the whole run of him?
I liked him a lot. It's more difficult to get a read on him than it is other Doctors because he's only been in, 18 episodes and hasn't been in much of some of them. Apparently his run in terms of hours is just a couple hours more than Eccleston. But I feel like we've got a stronger sense of Eccleston's Doctor because you get a complete arc for him from start to finish, whereas Ncuti Gatwa was just doing his thing and then decides to effectively kill himself to save someone. But I loved his energy. I thought he was a great lead for the show. I don't know what level of commitment he had outside of the show in terms of talking about, David Tennant was always very vocal about it and Matt Smith less so. Capaldi was vocal when he was on, but now whenever he gets asked about it, he's like, yeah, I did that. I don't need to talk about it or do it again. It was great when it lasted, but it's gone now. And Jodie Whittaker, great ambassador for the show as well. I don't get the sense that Ncuti Gatwa really, maybe he just doesn't have the opportunity to talk about it much outside of making it.
Well, the fact that he made it and then it was all released, that's the thing. The Reality War was filmed before Church on Ruby Road was released, or before Space Babies was released, the very latest. So there's an argument that Gatwa was never the current Doctor. You could make an argument that Gatwa was never in production after an episode of the show had aired or after a season of the show had aired, so he never really got to be part of that cycle. He did do press for it, but it always seemed like it was a very small amount of press because, as you say, Hollywood is coming knocking for him, and good for them. This is the thing with Matt Smith. I love that Matt Smith is always like, I love Doctor Who so much, I would show up in a heartbeat if they ever asked me back, but I'm kind of busy right now. I'm making a Darren Aronofsky movie. I love that Smith is like, I love the show. I'd love to come back for the 60th if only they asked me. And you're looking at his schedule and going, there is no way, Matt Smith, that you could make time to appear in the 60th. It's nice that you say it. I appreciate that you say it, but we both know that you're not doing a David Tennant and giving up your time or giving up House of the Dragon to come back and do Doctor Who again. And I do kind of wonder if the same might be true of Gatwa. We'll see. I feel like Gatwa could break out in the States. I feel like Gatwa could at least be a respected supporting actor in terms of Hollywood productions. He could go the route of, say, Gillen or Smith, which is nice. It's a nice legacy for the show to have. But it does raise the question of, if that happens, does he ever come back? Does he come back for the revival specials? Does he come back for Big Finish or whatever?
Must be comforting to know that money's on the table whenever you want it. Big Finish, you can always earn a living doing that.
Yeah, but whatever criticisms one can make of Big Finish, it's great as a retirement payment scheme for veterans of 80s television. It is a social good, that it means that these people can actually buy food and stuff.
So Jodie Whittaker's recorded 12 episodes, and also at the end of her run of Doctor Who, she was pregnant. So it's not too hard to go, you can sit down, it's an easy job, you can record from home.
Like, Tom Baker's like 93 and still doing it, right?
Apparently he has retired. I think they recorded a lot with him, but he's sort of done his bit.
Wonder how much it pays to do one of these.
Everyone seems to want to get into it because you have a bit of fun. You don't have to run around anywhere. You can just pretend you're running and have a great time.
Like these actors that were in half an episode of Star Trek that are still dining out on convention appearances decades later.
Yeah.
Isaac, what did you think of Ncuti Gatwa?
I thought it was really fun. It's difficult to have a fresh one because obviously he's the 15th one. And every time a new Doctor comes in, you compare them like, oh, well, this is a bit of Matt Smith's, a little bit of Patrick Troughton, and then Peter Capaldi's doing lots of John Pertweeisms. Whereas I think Ncuti Gatwa one, it was so wildly different. He didn't have a costume. He didn't have a catchphrase. He always exploded into his scenes. He's not a Doctor that you can say like, oh yeah, you can see the Tom Baconness or the David Tennantness in. He's the Ncuti Gatwiest Doctor they're going to be. He's not built of anything else. It's very infectious, the sense of joy and wonder that this Doctor has, taking people out to the stars, seeing places, saving people, just being the Doctor. It's obviously a Doctor that just loves doing it. I think that's very refreshing sometimes. I think towards the end of Stephen Moffat, I think it's global in the questions of Doctor, good man, what does it mean to be the Doctor? Sometimes it's just nice to have someone who's just like, this is great. This is proper mint. That I could dress as a Roman and go to Roman times and have a brilliant fun adventures. So he's definitely made an impact in his run. I think he's been really fun to watch. And obviously, in terms of acting talent, they really got a good deal on him because we don't have to get Doctors that good.
The issue might be that he was too good in terms of schedule. He's not hanging around. The problem is you need to hire somebody who's going to be hanging around the UK.
Yeah, probably why in the old days he just hired, I think Tom Bacon worked on a building site, Sylvester McCoy just did circuses, whatever. These guys are just paycheck guys, they'll stick around for a bit.
Yeah, and then the case of, say, David Tennant, Doctor Who made him. It's how he got work later on doing other things. And Peter Capaldi had already had his career, so it was just a lark around this for a little while.
And both of them were massive fans growing up as well, so it's one of the jobs I'd love to do. I think Ncuti Gatwa said he watched like David Tennant era and the Rusty Davis era one, so it would be a fun job to have on the CV. But I think he did a really brilliant one.
It is just a shame that Gatwa's Doctor is the one that's bookended by two very pointed, nostalgic returns.
Yeah.
It kind of feels like he's always in the shadow of the Russell T Davies era of Doctor Who. As much as the stories were original and experimental and interesting in their own right, you know how people, their sense memory is taken over by the finales.
I'm very fond of Gatwa myself. This is an odd thing to say because I like Tennant 1 a bit less than most people do, but he reminds me a lot of Tennant 1. Eccleston is playing a character across those 13 episodes. He has a clear arc. We talked about it, beginning, middle, and end. Tennant doesn't really have an arc across his run as Doctor Who. There's no way to connect the no second chances, that's what kind of man I am, to why did it have to be you, Wilf? Why couldn't it be anybody else? There's no way to connect those 2 points. It is just, he is the Doctor. And to me, Gatwa feels very much like that. He kind of is the Doctor. He has the kind of Tennant sense of just being a fixed object around which these stories happen, which is different to me than, say, Eccleston, then Smith, then Capaldi. I don't know if it's better or worse, but I like him a lot. He's an incredibly charismatic performer. It's hard not to love him. Like Tennant, he has this energy that he just brings to the show that I find really hard to resist.
Well, even one of his last lines is, I really like this face, which is very Tennant, isn't it?
Yeah, I wish we got more of him, such is life, but I also understand why we didn't. I think it's nice that we had him, and I would rather we had him than we didn't have him. If we had to do a compromise and we got a less charismatic performer with less star presence for 3 seasons, I'd be like, I'll take the 2 seasons of Gatwa over that.
And we'll possibly reconvene when we get the David Tennant, Billy Piper special next year.
That's fair, yeah.
Whenever they decide to make it, because that is apparently on the card. So that's one of the rumours. You're going to get them back.
Yep, Tennant and Piper. I love that Tennant's like, I'm done, I swear I'm done. But you know that the moment Davies picks up the phone and says, we need you, he's like, I'm on the way. I'm already dressed. I have the suits in my wardrobe.
Well, we've actually got a different outfit for this incarnation for you, David. Just going to wear different clothes every time. And look older as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, the enthusiasm's there. And I think the enthusiasm should be part of being the Doctor as well, because it's a one-hander really, isn't it? Well, the show is usually a 2 or 3-hander. But in terms of Doctor Who, there is the Doctor, and then everything else kind of orbits that.
Yeah, you could do the show without the TARDIS during the Pertwee era, for example. That's how essential the Doctor is, and everything else is negotiable.
Well, I think we're at the stage where we bring out our dead and see if there's anything that we didn't quite get to talk about. Isaac, is there anything that you didn't get to talk about that you absolutely must talk about before we hop in our TARDISes and leave?
I don't want to sound too pessimistic about the future or saying whether or not it's cancelling TV the right way or not. If this is TV Doctor Who, then such an ingrained thing with such a lot of people that it will continue forever in whatever form it is able to take. And I would definitely not say no if they did make more TV. 20 years is a long time. If it sort of peters out, this is it's been a great run. If they do more, fantastic, keep going. With Doctor Who, the ability to tell brilliant stories with it is never really going to go away, no matter what format it's in, whether it's more TV, books, audio, even just doing it yourself, might give it a go. But I think the Disney era of Doctor Who, the moniker it gained, it's had its ups and downs, but as sad, Christopher Eccleston's series is probably the only Doctor Who series of the one-on-one where it's the best one you'll get. You'll never really get a run that's solid where there's not really a bad one. And again, it's when you get to massive audiences, people are going to love certain ones and not like other ones. Not everything's going to please everybody. But I think it's definitely been a good run. It's 19 solid stories. And it's definitely a worthy Doctor amongst all the other ones. So to wrap it up, yeah, it's pretty good.
Darren, any last points that you didn't get to raise before we head off?
My voice is giving out, my interconnection's acting up. I apologize to all your listeners for my nasalness, but I think it's been a pretty good discussion of a pretty good era. I'm actually relatively happy with this era, allowing for the issues with the finales.
I'll just echo that. I think it was a good era of Doctor Who. It was consistently some of the best TV I was watching. Talked about on the Andor podcast that I was eating quite well when this was on, TV-wise. There was Andor, there was this, and there was The Last of Us, all very good. And now they're all finished, and there's nothing good on at the moment. Ironheart isn't out as we record yet, so maybe that'll be the one. Who knows? So I don't really have much to add either. I think we covered much of what we wanted to cover, so success. Perhaps, well, the listeners can be the judge of the success, but in terms of what I was aiming to get out of this, covered it. Darren, as the guest, do you want to tell the listeners your socials and where you can be found?
You can find me at Darren_Mooney on Twitter, Darren.Mooney at Blue Sky Social or whatever the address is over in there. I'm on Second Wind, which is on YouTube. You can find me every second week there, where I'm producing The Backdrop with the wonderful Jesse Schwab, the fantastic Omar Ahmed, which takes a look at pop culture. You can also find us every second week talking about pop culture on The Rewind, which we're very proud of, which is a podcast with myself, the wonderful Jack Packer, the fantastic Marty Sleva. And every Saturday you could check out The 250, which is the podcast that I co-host with my good friend Andrew Quinn. We've been very blessed. We've had the wonderful Craig on there as well, talking about The Predator recently. We will have been talking about Predator, Killer of Killers, I think, recently as this episode is coming out. So, contemporary reference, perhaps.
Well, that was our discussion about Doctor Who, Series 2, Season whatever. Who cares about the numbering? I would like to thank TARDIS71 for the supplied music. If you like what you heard, please do hit subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. There will most likely be a subscribe button that you can press, and most of these platforms have rating and review functionality built in. So Darren, how many stars should they give us?
I would suggest no fewer than 5 joys. 5 specific stars. Because if you're going to give a star, you should give a specific star. 5 joys.
Yeah. And Isaac, do you reckon we should get a comment too?
I mean, it's always welcome to have a comment, isn't it? It's always nice to have a bit of interaction.
Yeah. If you want to discuss Doctor Who or anything else, really, you can hit us up on Facebook, Twitter/Blue Sky under Kneel Before Blog, or you can leave a comment under kneelbeforeblog.co.uk. You can also join us on Discord, where we have an engaged community of still a listener. So if you want to help us make that plural, please do. For more deep dive analytical chats like this, a monthly news podcast, and the odd interview, you can continually catch us on Kneel Before Pod.